Imagine being an Edwardian city dweller around 1905. The streets are a mix of horse hooves, rattling carts, and the occasional motor car making a noise like a coughing dragon. Your home probably smells faintly of coal, your evenings are dimly lit by flickering gas lamps, and your entertainment choices include reading, knitting, or listening to Uncle Alfred explain again why the Boer War was mismanaged. Life is steady, predictable, and about as bright as a potato in a basement. Then, suddenly, someone shows up with a new magic trick. They flip a switch, and the room explodes with light. No matches, no soot, no flames licking dangerously close to your curtains. Just light. Today, we yawn when lights come on. Back then, people gasped, screamed, or applauded like they were at a magic show, because to them, that's exactly what it was, sorcery that came with wires. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The Edwardian era, roughly 1901 to 1914. The Victorians had left behind trains, telegraphs, and an empire that stretched so far it probably confused cartographers. But electricity was different. It wasn't just an invention, it was a revolution that promised to change everything from how you lit your street to how you boiled water. And unlike steam engines or factories, it wasn't confined to industry. This was a technology meant to seep directly into your living room. The very first demonstrations of electric light had already wowed Victorian audiences in the 1880s, but those were spectacles, not practical. By the time of the Edwardians, the infrastructure was finally catching up. Power stations were sprouting up in big cities, wires were creeping overhead and underground, and electricity was making the leap from novelty to necessity. It was arriving in people's lives with all the subtlety of a brass band marching through your kitchen. Imagine explaining electricity to your grandmother. You tell her there are invisible currents running through wires that make little filaments glow bright without fire. She nods politely, then privately adds your name to her prayer list. For many Edwardians, this was not just technology, it was unnatural. People asked, where does the light actually come from? Was it bottled sunlight? Tiny fireflies? A form of controlled lightning? There was also genuine fear. Electricity could kill, and the newspapers were only too happy to print stories of men zapped into eternity while fiddling with wires. Some readers concluded that having electricity in the home was like inviting death into your wallpaper. Yet despite this, curiosity won. People craved it, not because they understood it, but because it made them feel like they were living in the future. Humour beat. Imagine a world where flipping a switch makes light. Today we yawn. In 1905 people screamed. That scream wasn't always fear. Sometimes it was just shock at the sheer brightness. If you were used to the soft yellow glow of a gas flame, an electric bulb looked like staring directly into the sun. People described it as harsh, sterile, and far too bright for comfort. But that didn't matter. Brightness equaled progress, and progress meant bragging rights. As with any great invention, electricity didn't show up everywhere at once. The wealthy neighbourhoods got it first, because of course they did. Palaces, theatres and department stores were lit like beacons, while working-class streets remained gloomy and gaslit. This created a peculiar class divide. On one side of the city, people were living in a future of glowing bulbs and humming wires. On the other side, people were still fumbling with matches and cleaning soot off the ceiling. For the rich, electricity wasn't just practical, it was a status symbol. If your house had electric light, you could invite friends over and casually say things like, "Oh, don't mind the switch, it's terribly modern," while silently basking in their envy. For the poor, it was something to gawk at through shop windows, like a child staring at candy they couldn't afford. There's a reason the Edwardians called it an electric craze. They were literally buzzing with excitement. Electric light meant more than visibility. It represented safety, convenience, and modernity. Streets were brighter, which promised fewer crimes, at least in theory. Factories could operate longer hours. Homes could be free of the constant risk of fire from candles and gas. People began imagining a world where everything cooking, cleaning, transport would one day run on this magical force. Of course, most of them had no idea how it worked, and that was part of the appeal. Electricity was invisible, intangible, and mysterious. You couldn't touch it. Well, you could, but not recommended unless you enjoyed crisping like bacon. This sense of mystery gave it a quasi-religious aura. Preachers worried it might undermine faith, while advertisers assured everyone it was the hand of progress. In some ways, they were both right. Think about it. Before electricity, every form of light or heat required combustion. Fire was your universal tool. Suddenly, here was a system where no flame existed, no fuel was burned, and yet voila, light appeared. It made people question whether humans had finally harnessed the forces of nature in ways previously reserved for thunder gods. To an Edwardian living in the shadow of science, but still raised on folklore, this was both thrilling and terrifying. So the arrival of electricity in Edwardian cities wasn't just about utility, it was about wonder. It was about watching your world change at the flick of a switch. It was about stepping into a future that seemed impossible only a generation before. For the Edwardians, electricity wasn't boring infrastructure, it was sorcery, bottled up and distributed by engineers who wore suits instead of wizard robes. And like all good sorcery, it came with a cost: confusion, suspicion, and more than a few accidents. But that didn't matter, because once you saw that first electric glow, there was no going back. The Edwardians had been handed the future, and they were determined to live in it, even if half of them thought they might explode in the process. Picture an Edwardian city street at twilight. For centuries the setting sun meant shadows stretching long and dark, punctuated only by the dim yellow glow of oil lamps, then later gas lamps. Gaslight had become the accepted rhythm of urban life. Lamplighters with long poles shuffling down the street, lighting each lamp one by one as if they were summoning stars into existence. It was quaint, practical, and predictable. But then came electricity, and with it, the most dramatic transformation of urban nights that people had ever seen. Suddenly, lamplighters were out of a job, and Edwardian streets glowed with a brilliance so strange that many onlookers didn't know whether to cheer or cross themselves for protection. The transition wasn't smooth, of course. Gas companies had no intention of letting themselves be replaced by this upstart technology without a fight. After all, they had invested heavily in infrastructure, pipes and marketing campaigns that praised the romance of gaslight. They warned citizens that electric lamps were ugly, too harsh, and far too dangerous. And, to be fair, they had a point. Early electric streetlights sometimes hissed, flickered, or made unsettling popping sounds, as though they might explode at any moment. But even with these quirks, electricity had one undeniable advantage. It turned night into day. The moment the first electric lights flicked on in a neighbourhood, people stopped in their tracks. Gaslight offered a soft glow, comforting but weak. Electric light blazed. It illuminated not just the street, but the faces of everyone standing there, much to the dismay of those who had previously relied on shadows to disguise questionable fashion choices or late-night activities. The sheer clarity was unsettling. People weren't used to seeing cities so clearly at night. Shadows shrank, alleys lost their gloom, and night itself seemed a little less mysterious. For some, it felt liberating. For others, it was downright unnerving. There was also the spectacle factor. Turning on electric lights was not something that happened quietly. Imagine a mayor, surrounded by local dignitaries, preparing to unveil the city's new electric streetlights. A ceremonial switch was thrown, the lamps blazed to life, and the crowd gasped in amazement. It was theatre disguised as infrastructure. Entire neighbourhoods gathered just to witness the moment, applauding as if Thomas Edison himself had appeared to take a bow. In truth, the arrival of electric lighting was less about convenience at first, and more about civic pride. Cities wanted to show they were modern, that they could keep up with New York or Paris, that their nights would no longer be governed by sputtering flames. But the end of lamplighters was a real cultural loss. These men had been a familiar part of urban life, known in their communities and often entrusted with local gossip. Watching them vanish overnight felt like watching an old tradition snuffed out by the cold, relentless progress of wires and bulbs. Children missed waving at them, and old residents missed the comforting ritual of watching the lamps flare to life one by one. Humorously, newspapers joked that lamplighters might be redeployed as switch flippers, but sadly, there were no job openings for men to stand around waiting to press buttons. Progress can be cruel like that. The gas companies didn't just give up, though. They lobbied furiously, claiming that electricity caused eye strain and might even damage your health. Some argued that bright lights would encourage crime by making thieves more confident in their movements, because apparently nothing says stealth like being visible under a blazing arc lamp. Others clung to the idea that gaslight had an artistic charm that electricity could never replicate. And to be fair, they weren't wrong about the harshness. Early arc lamps were so dazzlingly bright they could blind you if you looked directly at them. Imagine trying to stroll down the street while feeling like you'd stared at the sun. Still, people preferred too bright to too dim. For ordinary citizens, the main question was safety. The wires looked ominous, the switches looked mysterious, and stories of electrocution spread like wildfire. People genuinely worried that standing too close to a lamppost might zap them into oblivion. Children were warned not to touch the new streetlights, and superstitions circulated about sparks jumping from the lamps at night. Yet despite all this fear, the allure was irresistible. Walking down a newly lit street was like stepping into the future, and most Edwardians wanted to be part of that, even if they did keep a cautious distance from the poles. The electric light also reshaped nightlife in ways people didn't immediately realise. Businesses could stay open later, shoppers could browse long after sunset. Public gatherings no longer had to end with the last glow of gas. Suddenly, the city pulsed with activity, well into the night. This was more than convenience, it was cultural transformation. People discovered that the city at night could be as lively as the city at day, and that was a revelation. It's easy to forget how shocking this was because for us, streetlights are a background detail. We complain when one is out, but in the Edwardian world, the first flick of the switch was a public event, a signal that life itself was changing. No more lamplighters climbing poles, just men wondering if electricity would fry them first. And while gaslight lingered in some areas, its days were numbered. The blaze of electric lamps was simply too powerful to resist, both literally and symbolically. By the time the Edwardians settled into this new rhythm, they realised that cities looked fundamentally different. Nights were brighter, safer, louder and busier. Electricity hadn't just replaced gaslight, it had transformed what it meant to live in a city after dark. And once that switch had been flicked, there was no turning back. If the first flick of the switch dazzled Edwardians with blazing electric light, the next thing they noticed was the messy business of keeping those lights powered. Wires. And not just a few discrete lines tucked neatly out of sight. No, Edwardian cities quickly became jungles of cables crisscrossing overhead, sagging between poles, sprouting from rooftops like overgrown weeds. Every street looked like a cat had gotten tangled in yarn, but the yarn was deadly. To modern eyes, electricity seems invisible. We live with hidden infrastructure, wires buried under streets, power stations humming discreetly behind fences, but in the early 20th century, electricity strutted itself across the skyline. The technology was new, the engineering was experimental, and urban planners hadn't quite worked out how to blend modernity with tidiness. The result was a spectacle of poles, wires, and transformers that made entire neighbourhoods look like a badly drawn sketch. And those wires weren't subtle. Thick black cables looped across streets, knotted into ungainly clusters, drooping at angles that made pedestrians nervous. There was no attempt at beauty or order. Electricity wasn't there to charm you, it was there to work. But the effect was undeniable. The sky itself seemed to have grown a dark web. In some neighbourhoods you could scarcely look up without seeing a tangle of lines that buzzed faintly in damp weather. For Edwardians, this was both fascinating and terrifying. People would gather beneath poles, squinting at the wires, whispering to each other about how power travelled invisibly along them. To those who didn't understand electricity, which, frankly, was most people, the wires looked like traps waiting to strike. Stories circulated about wires snapping in storms and writhing like snakes on the pavement, sparking ominously, until someone managed to cut the current. And while many of these tales were exaggerated, they weren't entirely false. Accidents did happen, and the thought of being zapped by a loose cable kept many citizens at a wary distance. The cluttered skyline wasn't just an aesthetic issue, it became a source of civic debate. City councils wrestled with complaints about wire pollution. Newspapers printed grumbles about once beautiful boulevards now resembling industrial scaffolding. For the wealthy, who prided themselves on elegant architecture and clean vistas, the wires were offensive. Imagine owning a grand Edwardian townhouse with Corinthian columns and stained glass windows, only to find a fat black wire stretched across your view like an unwanted clothesline. Some protested, demanding that companies bury the cables underground. Others shrugged and said, "Well, it's progress. At least we can see our shoes at night now." Competition only made the mess worse. In some cities, multiple companies strung up their own wires because monopolies hadn't yet formed. This meant 3 or 4 sets of cables running along the same street, each belonging to a rival provider. The result was chaos. Photographs from the time show intersections so tangled with wires they look like spiderwebs spun by an arachnid on a sugar rush. It wasn't uncommon for companies to accuse each other of sabotage when wires mysteriously snapped. Sometimes the rivalries turned into literal street fights between workers who climbed poles like rival gangs claiming turf. And then there was the sound. People reported faint humming or buzzing on damp evenings, as if the wires were alive and whispering. For those inclined towards superstition, it added to the eerie aura of electricity, an invisible force crackling just above their heads. Some joked that the wires were singing lullabies, while others swore they were omens of doom. Either way, it was hard to ignore the sense that the sky had grown a nervous system. Not everyone hated the wires, though. Some Edwardians marvelled at them, seeing in their clutter the proof of living in a modern age. Wires meant power, power meant light, and light meant progress. Poets even described the tangle of cables as the arteries of the city, pumping invisible lifeblood into every street and home. Children found them thrilling, daring each other to throw stones at the poles just to hear the wires quiver. Parents, of course, responded with horror. "Don't you dare touch those, unless you want to glow in the dark." The wires also created new hazards for an old problem: horses. Carriages often tangled reins around poles, and startled horses could panic at the sight of sparks from faulty wires. In a time when horse traffic still dominated, adding electric hazards to the streets was a recipe for chaos. More than one unlucky Edwardian found themselves explaining to their insurance agent that their cart hadn't been hit by another vehicle, but by an overly enthusiastic electric pole. And yet, despite all the mess, the wires became part of city life. People grew used to ducking under them, ignoring their buzzing, and navigating around the forest of poles. In fact, for many, they became symbols of pride. If your neighbourhood had wires, you were modern. If it didn't, you were still in the dark, literally. And so, even as critics complained, the web of cables spread further and further, climbing higher into the skyline and snaking deeper into city streets. Looking back, it's tempting to laugh at the untidy sprawl of early electrical infrastructure, but at the time, it represented something monumental, the visible skeleton of the future. The wires may have been ugly, inconvenient and occasionally dangerous, but they were also proof that life was changing. Cities were no longer bound by the sun or the limits of flame. They had tapped into something bigger, stranger, and far more powerful. Every street looked like a cat had gotten tangled in yarn, but the yarn was deadly, and yet despite the risks, people learned to live with it because nothing said modern city quite like a sky filled with wires. Progress always comes with a side effect: paranoia. And in Edwardian cities, nothing seemed to spark paranoia quite like electricity. It wasn't just that people didn't understand how it worked, it was that they couldn't even see it. Steam was visible, gas had a smell, fire crackled where you could watch it. Electricity? Invisible, odourless, silent, yet powerful enough to kill you in a heartbeat. To Edwardians, it was like inviting a ghost into your home and hoping it would behave. Newspapers gleefully fanned the flames. Every time an accident occurred, a worker electrocuted while stringing wires, or a faulty lamp sparking a fire, it made the headlines. Readers devoured these stories, often exaggerating them in the retelling. Soon, urban legends spread faster than the wires themselves. People whispered that just standing near an electric pole in a thunderstorm could fry you where you stood, or that if you touched 2 wires at once you'd explode like a firecracker. One rumour claimed that the electric current could leap from a bulb and attack a person, like a cat waiting to pounce. And then there was the brain-frying myth. Some sincerely believed that staring too long at a glowing bulb could damage the mind or cook your brain, microwave style, without the leftovers. Mothers warned children not to look directly at bulbs the way we tell kids today not to stare at the sun. Except instead of worrying about eyesight, Edwardians fretted about madness. Electric insanity became a phrase muttered half jokingly, half seriously. If someone acted strangely, It was easy to blame the new lights rather than Aunt Gertrude's lifelong eccentricities. Public demonstrations only added fuel. Inventors and showmen loved to shock crowds, sometimes literally by passing current through themselves or lighting up dozens of bulbs with a single machine. One particularly theatrical trick involves sending electricity through a man's body to make his hair stand on end. Audiences gasped in awe, but also left with the impression that electricity could jump inside you and never let go. It didn't help that some quacks offered electric health treatments, where patients were zapped with small jolts to cure anything from back pain to shyness. For the gullible, this was proof that electricity was dangerous and miraculous. For skeptics, it was evidence that everyone had gone mad. Fear also crept into the home. Many households hesitated before installing electric light, even when they could afford it. People worried that wires running through the walls might heat up and start fires without warning. Some insisted that electricity could seep into the air and poison it, much like gas leaks. Housewives refused to dust bulbs for fear of getting shocked. Servants sometimes refused to work in electrified houses, convinced that brushing against the wrong wall might send them straight to the afterlife. The paranoia took stranger turns as well. Conspiracy theories flourished. A few claimed that electricity wasn't just about lighting, it was a plot by companies to spy on households. Others believed the government could use wires to control people's thoughts, turning ordinary citizens into puppets. It sounds absurd now, but remember, this was a time when most people didn't understand the difference between volts and lightning bolts. To the Edwardian imagination, the possibilities, both wonderful and sinister, were endless. Of course, some of these fears were not entirely baseless. Early electrical systems were far from safe. Insulation was poor, equipment was experimental, and protective regulations barely existed. People did get shocked, fires did start, and deaths did occur. The line between genuine risk and exaggerated paranoia was blurry. Imagine being told to trust something that could both light your parlour beautifully and kill a man instantly. It's no wonder people hesitated. And then came the rumours about animals. Cats allegedly fried themselves by climbing poles. Horses supposedly keeled over after brushing against live wires. Dogs were said to bark incessantly at buzzing cables because they could hear death coming. These stories weren't always true, but they reinforced the belief that electricity was unnatural. If animals seen as instinctive and wise reacted badly, surely that was a sign. Humour also became a way to cope with fear. Cartoonists poked fun at citizens too nervous to enter an electrified theatre, or caricatured dandies whose hair stood on end after sitting too close to a bulb. Jokes circulated that electricity could recharge a tired husband, or make an old woman dance like a child. Beneath the laughter, though, was genuine unease. Electricity was everywhere, and no one fully understood it. At the same time, fascination and fear coexisted. People might mutter about dangers, but still gather in awe under a blazing arc lamp. They might warn their children not to stare at bulbs, but brag to neighbours that their parlour was wired. It was a paradox. The very thing they feared also made them feel proud, modern, and part of something extraordinary. In the end, paranoia about electricity was less about science and more about psychology. The Edwardians were facing a world where invisible forces shaped daily life. Electricity represented a leap into the unknown, and fear was simply the price of wonder. Yes, people thought it might cook their brains, start fires, or let the government control their dreams, but they also couldn't stop looking up at the glowing bulbs and thinking, this is the future. Electricity terrified them, fascinated them, and electrified their imaginations all at once. And really, what could be more Edwardian than that? If there was one group of people who looked at electricity and thought, perfect, we can annoy people with this, it was advertisers. The Edwardians didn't waste much time realising that electric light could do more than illuminate streets and parlours. It could sell things, and not politely either. Gone were the quaint painted signs and the gas-lit shop windows of the Victorian era. With electricity, advertisements could blaze so brightly they practically reached into your skull. Signs didn't just say buy soap, they screamed it until your eyeballs gave up. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Department stores, theatres and shops threw themselves into the electric craze with gusto, rigging up signs that glowed, blinked and even moved. Imagine walking down an Edwardian street at night and seeing not just one or two glowing signs, but entire rows of them. Each store wanted to outshine its neighbour. and the result was a cityscape that looked less like a shopping district and more like the aftermath of a lightning storm. Theatres were the early champions of this trend. They discovered that plastering their facades with blazing electric bulbs drew crowds as surely as the performers inside. People who couldn't afford a ticket still gathered just to stare at the lights, treating the theatre itself as a free spectacle. Producers bragged about how many bulbs lit their marquees, competing for the highest count like children comparing marbles. One theatre in London reportedly strung up thousands of bulbs, creating a glow so intense passers-by joked it could be seen from the moon. Audiences, of course, loved it. The play inside might be dreadful, but at least the outside promised excitement. But it wasn't just theatres. Shops embraced electric advertising too. Grocers lit up their windows so their produce gleamed like treasures. Tailors rigged displays where bulbs traced the outlines of jackets and hats, making even the dullest suit look like it belonged to a star. Pharmacies used electric signs to tout miracle tonics, glowing as if to suggest the bottles inside contained bottled lightning. If gaslight had once made the city seem romantic, electric advertising made it loud. The urban night was no longer a soft blur of yellow lamps, it was a shouting match. And then came the arrival of neon. Though still in its infancy during the Edwardian period, the discovery of neon lighting meant that signs didn't just glow, they glowed in colour. Suddenly, reds, greens and blues blazed across shop fronts. People were both mesmerised and mildly terrified. Red neon signs were sometimes compared to infernos, while green ones reminded suspicious citizens of witchcraft. But whether they loved it or feared it, people couldn't look away. Electric advertising had done what all advertising aims to do, make itself unavoidable. Of course, the technology wasn't perfect. Early bulbs had a tendency to burn out or flicker, leaving half-lit words that sent unintentional messages. A sign meant to say "eat beef" might sputter into "ate bee," confusing everyone except nearby beekeepers. Sometimes, signs simply failed altogether, leaving a dark gap in an otherwise glowing street like a missing tooth in a smile. This unreliability didn't deter advertisers. They simply hired workers to climb ladders nightly, replacing bulbs and rewiring connections. The brightness caused complaints too. Residents living near heavily lit districts often grumbled that the lights kept them awake, shining through their curtains like artificial dawn. Satirical papers published cartoons of Edwardian households bathed in so much unwanted light they could read in bed without lamps. Some doctors even claimed the new signs were bad for public health, warning of light fatigue and predicting a generation of citizens with strained nerves and twitching eyelids. Of course, these warnings only added to the allure. If it was bad for you, it must be modern. For business owners, the benefits outweighed the complaints. An electric sign meant your shop was impossible to ignore, and in a crowded market that mattered. Customers naturally drifted toward the brightest, most dazzling displays, just like moths to a flame, though ideally without the tragic ending. Sales rose, reputations grew, and soon having an electric sign wasn't just clever, it was essential. If your shop didn't glow, it might as well be invisible. The cultural impact was enormous. Streets once quiet after sunset now thrummed with life as people strolled just to admire the spectacle. Tourists came to see the Great White Ways, stretches of city bathed in electric glow, where advertising and urban pride blended together. In these places, modernity wasn't just a concept, it was something you could see, feel and squint at until your eyes watered. What's remarkable is how quickly electric advertising rewired public expectations. Within just a few years, citizens who once complained the lights were garish began demanding more of them. Cities without glowing thoroughfares felt backward, left behind in the shadows. Young couples used neon signs as meeting points. Children begged their parents to take them downtown just to gape at the lights. Even critics who denounced the vulgarity of electric advertising secretly admitted it was hypnotic. Signs didn't just sell products, they sold the idea of progress itself. Every glowing letter was a promise that the Edwardian city was modern, alive, and part of a new electric age. People might not have trusted electricity in their homes, but they couldn't resist it in the streets. By the end of the Edwardian era, electric advertising had permanently altered the relationship between commerce and the city at night. Darkness was no longer neutral space, it was territory to be conquered, branded and sold. The shop fronts had become mini suns, burning not for warmth or comfort, but for profit, and the Edwardians, dazzled and half-blinded, marched straight into the consumer future. If there was one place where electricity wasn't just functional but the star of the show, it was at exhibitions and world's fairs. These grand spectacles of the Edwardian age were where cities flaunted their modernity, governments showed off their industrial muscle, and inventors hoped to dazzle their way into history. Electricity didn't simply sneak into these fairs as an accessory, it burst in like a celebrity demanding centre stage. Imagine paying a ticket to watch light bulbs. Today that's just a boring trip to IKEA, but in 1905 it was headline entertainment. The tradition of showing off technology at exhibitions dated back to the mid-19th century, but electricity gave the whole concept new life. Before, visitors might marvel at steam engines puffing away or mechanical looms clattering like caffeinated spiders. But once electric light and power entered the mix, the exhibitions shifted from noisy demonstrations of industry to glowing pageants of the future. Crowds weren't just impressed, they were spellbound. After all, this wasn't about staring at gears and pistons. This was about standing in a hall suddenly bathed in brilliant, unnatural light that made people feel as though they had stepped onto another planet. Take the 1900 Paris Exposition, often cited as the pinnacle of electric showmanship before the Edwardian era. By the time the Edwardians were hosting their own fairs, they were determined to outdo Paris, and that meant even bigger displays, even brighter lights, even more shocking demonstrations. Cities like London, Glasgow and St. Louis poured vast sums into exhibitions where electricity was plastered across every surface. Buildings glowed with hundreds of thousands of bulbs, fountains sparkled with hidden electric pumps, and pavilions showcased machines that hummed, whirred, and occasionally shocked unwary visitors. For many ordinary Edwardians, these fairs were their first chance to see electricity up close. Not everyone had electric light at home, and not every street had been wired yet. But at the fair you could wander through halls that glowed with relentless brilliance, marvel at enormous dynamos spinning like caged beasts, and watch demonstrations where wires carried power over distances that seemed unimaginable. People lined up just to see a row of bulbs lit all at once, as though it were fireworks frozen in place. Children squealed, adults gasped, and newspapers reported on these events, as if humanity had crossed into an entirely new dimension. And it wasn't just light. Electric exhibits promised wonders in every corner of life. Electric cookers baked cakes on stage. Electric fans blew breezes across crowds, prompting many to laugh as their hats went flying. Some booths offered electric massages, which looked suspiciously like wires strapped to chairs that jolted you into sitting straighter. There were electric sewing machines, electric vacuum contraptions, even electric tea kettles. Visitors whispered that soon every task might be handled by invisible power, and if some doubted the practicality, it hardly mattered. The spectacle alone was worth the price of admission. The organisers knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't just showing inventions, they were selling a vision of the future. Electricity became the physical symbol of progress itself. Walking through a brilliantly lit exhibition was like walking through a promise that the 20th century would be brighter, cleaner, faster, and perhaps just a little bit dangerous. Fairground pamphlets gushed about a future where electric trains carried you anywhere, electric stoves cooked every meal, and electric heaters made cold winters bearable. Optimism crackled in the air as tangibly as the current in the wires. Of course, there were mishaps. With so much experimental equipment on display, accidents were inevitable. Sometimes a bulb would burst dramatically, showering nearby visitors with glass. Occasionally a machine sparked so violently that staff had to rush in with sand buckets. One exhibition in Britain famously had to shut down a pavilion after its electric fountain nearly electrocuted an unlucky cleaner. These blunders only fueled the public's sense of awe. If electricity could cause chaos in the hands of engineers, what might it do in your humble home? It was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. At night, the fairs became even more magical. Whole avenues of exhibition halls lit up, glowing in ways no city had ever glowed before. Coloured bulbs outlined towers and arches, searchlights swept across the skies like artificial stars, couples strolled hand in hand, marvelling at the transformation of the ordinary into something otherworldly. Visitors often described the experience in near-religious terms, an epiphany of light that made the world itself feel changed. If daytime was impressive, nighttime was unforgettable. For Edwardians who attended these fairs, the experience lingered long after they returned home. They might still live in neighbourhoods lit by gas lamps, boiling water over coal fires, but they had glimpsed the electric future. And once you've seen an entire palace outlined in glittering bulbs, your own dim kitchen lamp feels a bit pathetic. The fairs planted seeds of expectation. People began demanding electricity in their streets, their shops, their houses. The exhibitions didn't just entertain, they created customers. The thrill of the fair wasn't just about bulbs and machines. It was about spectacle, optimism, and the intoxicating promise that humanity had cracked open nature itself and stolen lightning from the sky. The fairs made electricity not just a technology but a dream, and once the Edwardians had dreamed it, there was no waking up. Electricity might have begun as a public spectacle, lighting streets, dazzling at exhibitions, humming in factories, but its real test came when it entered the drawing rooms of the wealthy. For Edwardian elites, adopting electricity wasn't just about convenience, it was about sending a message. We are rich enough to flirt with danger and fashionable enough to keep up with Paris. And nothing screamed status quite like an electric chandelier dangling over a dinner table. If you didn't have an electric chandelier, were you even rich, or just pretending with candles like a medieval peasant? The Edwardian chandelier was not subtle. Gone were the delicate candle holders of the Georgian era or the respectable gas fittings of the Victorians. The new fixtures were sprawling metal beasts, dripping with glass or crystal, each arm tipped with the glaring novelty of a bulb. The point wasn't just to light a room, it was to overwhelm it. These chandeliers glowed so brightly that guests had to squint through dinners, blinking as if they were being interrogated by Scotland Yard between courses. But subtlety was never the goal. This was luxury measured in lumens. Installing such a marvel wasn't as simple as hanging it up. The wiring alone was a major operation. In many cases, electricians had to bore into walls, string wires through ceilings, and pray that the house didn't catch fire in the process. The wealthiest families even commissioned private power generators to keep their houses running, since city grids were unreliable. Imagine the smugness of being able to boast, "Oh, the neighbourhood is dark? How ghastly." We have our own supply, of course. The chandelier thus became more than a decoration. It was a glowing symbol of independence and superiority. Guests couldn't help but notice. Stepping into a grand dining room lit by electricity was like stepping onto a stage. Every feature of the room, the polished wood, the silver cutlery, the fashionable gowns blazed under the unforgiving brilliance. Gaslight had been flattering, forgiving of wrinkles and stains. Electric light, on the other hand, revealed everything. For the insecure, this was horrifying. For the wealthy, it was exhilarating. The chandelier didn't just illuminate the room, it illuminated their success. And yet, even among the elite, there were whispers of fear. Guests sometimes hesitated to sit directly beneath the chandelier, worried that a bulb might burst and shower them with hot glass. Or worse, that faulty wiring might send sparks raining down with the soup. Superstitions flourished. Some claimed that sleeping in a room lit by electricity could sap your vitality, while others swore the constant glow could bleach the colour from paintings and upholstery. Of course, these warnings didn't stop the rich from installing ever larger, ever brighter fixtures. The risk was part of the thrill. Owning an electric chandelier was a way of saying, "Yes, I'm so wealthy I can afford to gamble with death every evening." The obsession even spilled into interior design. Architects began constructing houses with higher ceilings and wider rooms, just to accommodate extravagant lighting schemes. Some homeowners went so far as to install switchboards that controlled dozens of circuits, allowing them to stage elaborate light shows for their guests. Imagine pressing a button and watching your entire ballroom blaze to life at once, an effect guaranteed to make visitors gasp and servants mutter darkly about wasted wages. For the Edwardian aristocrat, this was electricity as theatre. Of course, chandeliers weren't the only luxury. Smaller electric fixtures also became fashionable. Wall sconces shaped like flowers, desk lamps with Art Nouveau shades, glowing glass ornaments designed to impress. But the chandelier remained the crown jewel. It was the centerpiece of the Edwardian electrical fantasy, something you could show off at dinner parties, gossip about at teas, and sneer at your neighbours for lacking. In an era obsessed with appearances, light itself became a commodity. The extravagance also created new etiquette dilemmas. How bright should you keep the chandelier during dinner? Too dim, and it looked as though you were cheap. Too bright, and your guests left with headaches. Some hosts struck a compromise by turning on only part of the fixture, though this often looked like your chandelier had a bad case of the measles. Others simply left everything blazing and instructed their guests to drink more wine until they stopped noticing. Critics of this opulence weren't hard to find. Satirical papers mocked the wealthy for living inside light bulbs, publishing cartoons of fashionable couples roasted under chandeliers like Sunday roasts. Social commentators scolded the extravagance, pointing out that while the rich dined under dazzling bulbs, the poor still struggled with smoky candles. But for the elites, criticism was half the fun. Electricity was a dividing line, and the chandelier made sure everyone knew which side you stood on. The electric chandelier was therefore more than decoration, more than technology. It was a statement. It said you had the means to keep up with progress, the confidence to invite danger into your dining room, and the vanity to light every wrinkle on your face in excruciating detail. The Edwardians may not have invented electricity, but they certainly turned it into a status symbol, and for them, that was the most shocking luxury of all. Electricity in the Edwardian home wasn't just about chandeliers blazing over dining tables. It was about gadgets. Wonderful, strange, occasionally terrifying gadgets that promised to transform housework forever. For centuries, domestic labour had been sweaty, time-consuming, and powered by human muscles, usually servants. Then came the parade of electric appliances, kettles, toasters, irons, and other contraptions that marched into homes like soldiers of progress. The toaster was revolutionary, because nothing says progress like burning bread evenly. Imagine being a housewife in 1908. Your mornings usually involve fetching coal, lighting fires, and hoping the chimney doesn't smoke you out before breakfast is ready. Then one day, a salesman arrives with an electric kettle. No smoke, no coal, no endless waiting. Just water boiled at the flick of a switch. It felt like witchcraft. The tea boiled without fire. Somewhere, your grandmother fainted into a porridge. The toaster was even stranger. Before electricity, toasting bread meant balancing it precariously over a flame, often ending in either raw dough or carbonized brick. Now, here was a machine that cradled your slice in glowing wires and spat out something both edible and modern. Of course, early toasters didn't have safety features, timers, or even covers. They were basically little cages of exposed hot coils. Many Edwardians quickly learned that burning bread evenly could just as easily mean burning your fingers evenly. Still, it was a marvel, and breakfast would never be the same again. The electric iron also promised liberation, though whether it delivered is debatable. Traditional irons had to be heated on stoves, cooled down, reheated, and constantly juggled. The electric version plugged into the wall and stayed hot as long as the current flowed. For servants, this was a blessing. No more rushing between the kitchen fire and the laundry. For mistresses of the house, it was a badge of modernity. Owning an electric iron was like saying, "Yes, my clothing is pressed by lightning itself." The downside, forgetting to unplug it, could scorch not just a shirt but an entire table. Fire brigades were less impressed by progress than fashion-conscious ladies. These gadgets quickly turned into status symbols. Having an electric kettle or toaster meant you weren't just rich, you were futuristic. Guests might politely ignore your new curtains, but they would definitely notice when your tea appeared faster than they could complain about the weather. Some hosts even staged little demonstrations. "Observe, ladies, the bread will toast itself. Yes, no smoke, no flames, though please do stand back in case it explodes." But with novelty came nerves. People weren't entirely comfortable with wires running through their homes, and the idea of plugging a device directly into the mysterious force of electricity was alarming. Some owners insisted on keeping appliances in specific rooms, usually far from where children could wander. Others hid them when guests visited, worried they would seem reckless. Yet curiosity almost always won out. Once you saw a kettle boil without smoke, you couldn't go back. Manufacturers knew this, and they leaned hard into marketing. Advertisements portrayed electric appliances as the future of civilized life, particularly targeting middle and upper-class women. Brochures showed radiant housewives smiling over gleaming gadgets, their hair perfectly coiffed and their aprons suspiciously spotless. Electricity was pitched not as luxury but as liberation. Less drudgery, more leisure. Of course, this was somewhat misleading. In reality, many households still relied on servants, who were the ones actually wrestling with the temperamental devices. But the fantasy sold, and people bought. There was also an element of spectacle. At exhibitions and department stores, appliances were displayed like exotic animals. Irons sizzling on cloth, kettles steaming like dragons, toasters spitting out perfectly bronzed bread. Crowds gathered to gape, not necessarily to buy. For many Edwardians, seeing these contraptions in action was entertainment in itself. Imagine, a kettle without a fire was the kind of gossip you might share with neighbours for weeks afterward. Of course, early appliances were not cheap. They were investments, often requiring not just the device itself, but proper wiring and sometimes even your own generator. If your neighbourhood lacked power, this made them markers of class. If you had an electric toaster, you were practically royalty. If you didn't, well, better luck with your smoky fire and half-charred bread. The impact of these gadgets went beyond convenience. They began to shift the balance of domestic life. Servants were gradually less necessary for basic tasks, and mistresses of the house could proudly declare that they themselves had boiled water or toasted bread without lifting coal. It was a small step toward a future where homes would be filled with machines, each doing a job once considered tedious. For Edwardians, these first appliances weren't just tools. They were glimpses of a world where labour itself might be electrified. But let's not romanticize it too much. The gadgets were clunky, unreliable, and sometimes lethal. A forgotten iron could burn down a room. A faulty kettle could short-circuit and electrocute the unwary. Early toasters occasionally sparked into little firestorms, leading one critic to quip that they were perfect for those who prefer their bread flambéed. Yet these flaws didn't stop the parade. If anything, they added to the allure. Progress was meant to be a little dangerous. By the end of the Edwardian period, the sight of an electric kettle or toaster was becoming less shocking, though still far from universal. The gadgets had established themselves as symbols of modern living, proof that electricity wasn't just for public displays or chandeliers. It could invade the most mundane corners of daily life. The future had arrived, and it came in the form of tea brewed by lightning and bread roasted by sparks. The Edwardian household ran on hierarchy, polish, and a small army of servants who kept the machinery of upper-class life running smoothly. But when electricity began creeping into parlours and kitchens, it did more than brighten rooms and boil kettles. It raised an uncomfortable question: what happens to tradition when machines start replacing people? Why hire a butler when a plug socket will make tea? Badly, but without answering back. Servants were the backbone of Edwardian society. From butlers guarding the wine cellar to maids scrubbing floors before dawn, every task was meticulously divided among human hands. Entire households ran like clockwork, albeit a clock powered by fatigue and social expectation. For the wealthy, servants weren't just practical help, they were a badge of status. The more footmen standing around doing absolutely nothing, the richer you looked. So when electric gadgets entered the scene, they didn't just promise convenience, they threatened to chip away at a system that had defined class life for centuries. Take the electric kettle. A mistress could now, in theory, boil water without ringing a bell for the kitchen maid. Revolutionary? Yes, but also disruptive. The same went for irons, toasters, and vacuum cleaners, gadgets that performed tasks traditionally assigned to servants. The devices weren't perfect, of course. Early toasters burned bread, irons scorched shirts, and vacuum cleaners weighed as much as a small horse. But they carried a symbolic weight. Each new machine whispered, maybe you don't need quite so many people in livery after all. Servants, understandably, were suspicious. To them, electricity wasn't a marvel, it was a rival. Maids muttered that the devil's current would ruin their jobs. Some flatly refused to touch electrical appliances, claiming they were dangerous or unchristian. But behind the pious excuses was a deeper fear: redundancy. A maid who once spent hours boiling water and ironing sheets might find herself with nothing to do if a mistress armed with gadgets decided she could manage alone. Mistresses of the house faced their own dilemma. On one hand, electrical gadgets were thrilling. Demonstrating them to friends was a social triumph. Look, my kettle boils without a flame. On the other hand, there was a question of dignity. Using appliances directly blurred the line between lady and servant. For generations, upper-class women had managed households by delegating, not by rolling up their sleeves. If they suddenly started fussing with plugs and switches, were they modern, or were they descending into labour unbecoming of their class? Some compromised by treating gadgets as curiosities, playing with them in front of guests, then handing them off to servants for real use. This created some odd scenarios. Imagine a wealthy Edwardian lady demonstrating her shiny new vacuum cleaner at a tea party, proudly rolling it across the carpet for a few minutes before summoning her maid to finish the job. The message was clear: electricity was fashionable, but actual housework was still beneath her. Progress, it seemed, could only stretch so far before bumping into social convention. The butlers, footmen and cooks were equally conflicted. A butler might scoff at the idea that an electric bell system could replace his careful management of staff. A cook might wrinkle her nose at an electric oven, insisting that only coal-produced food with character. Yet slowly, grudgingly, even servants began to adapt. An iron that held its heat reliably was easier than running back and forth to the fire. A kettle that boiled quickly meant more tea for less effort. Machines may have been rivals, but they also made back-breaking tasks a little easier. Still, the anxiety lingered. Newspapers and satirical magazines poked fun at the notion of mechanical servants. Cartoons showed wealthy families attended not by footmen, but by rows of gadgets. Clumsy toasters dropping bread on the floor, irons burning holes in shirts, and kettles boiling over onto priceless carpets. The joke, of course, was that while machines promised efficiency, they lacked the polish and personality of real staff. You couldn't scold a toaster for looking sullen, and a kettle didn't know when to cough discreetly to warn you the guests were bored. It wasn't just servants who worried. For the middle classes, electricity complicated social aspirations. Hiring a maid or two was a way to climb the social ladder, but if gadgets could do the same work, would relying on them make you look modern or make you look cheap? Owning a vacuum cleaner might save you wages, but it also revealed you couldn't afford a proper household staff. In this way, electricity blurred the markers of class, making everyone a little uncertain about where they stood. Of course, the truly wealthy weren't about to dismiss their armies of staff overnight. For them, gadgets were luxuries, not replacements. An electric iron might ease a maid's work, but it didn't eliminate the need for her presence. A chandelier needed someone to polish it. A vacuum cleaner needed someone to lug it up the stairs. Electricity streamlined some tasks, but it didn't eliminate the culture of service that defined Edwardian domestic life. At least, not yet. Still, the writing was on the wall, or rather, humming in the wires. Electricity was a glimpse of a future where machines might one day replace servants entirely. The Edwardians couldn't know it, but they were at the edge of a social revolution. Within a generation, households would shrink, gadgets would multiply, and servants would become rare. But for now, in the Edwardian drawing room, the conversation was less about whether gadgets could replace staff, and more about how to use them without looking ridiculous. So the servant problem wasn't really about servants at all. It was about identity, class, and the awkward collision between tradition and technology. Electricity had begun its quiet work of unsettling social norms, not by frying brains or setting curtains ablaze, but by making tea faster than a butler ever could. Electricity wasn't just creeping into Edwardian homes with kettles and chandeliers, it was thundering through the streets in the form of trams and underground trains. For the first time in history, ordinary people could board a vehicle that didn't rely on the stench of horses, the choking smoke of steam, or the wheezing of human lungs pushing a cart. Instead, it glided forward on invisible power, humming with mysterious energy. Suddenly, your commute was faster, cheaper, and came with a small chance of death by sparks. The tram was the first great ambassador of electric transport. Earlier horse-drawn trams had been slow, smelly, and prone to leaving gifts in the streets. Steam trams were faster, but they bellowed clouds of smoke that made passengers feel as though they'd just crawled out of a coal mine. Electric trams promised something entirely new: speed without stink, power without smoke. With a cable above and a spark at the pole, they zipped along the streets with such smoothness that people compared them to magic carpets, albeit ones that occasionally showered sparks like angry fireworks. For city dwellers, the arrival of trams was transformative. Journeys that once took an hour by foot or carriage could now be completed in a fraction of the time. Suddenly, workers could live further from factories, clerks could move beyond walking distance from the office, and shoppers could reach entire districts they'd never considered before. The tram expanded the city, stretching its boundaries and knitting neighbourhoods together with rails and wires. Property values near tram lines soared, and shopkeepers rubbed their hands with glee as new customers rolled straight to their doors. But not everyone was thrilled. Horses, already spooked by motorcars, regarded electric trams as hellish demons on wheels. Sparks crackled overhead as the tram's trolley pole scraped against wires, and the sound alone was enough to send horses bolting into lampposts. Pedestrians, too, were wary. Trams ran faster and quieter than horse-drawn vehicles, which meant you could step into the street and find yourself nearly flattened by a silent juggernaut. Newspapers gleefully reported on accidents, warning citizens to look both ways for death on rails. Safety campaigns tried to reassure people, but the truth was obvious. Trams made the city both more convenient and more dangerous. The Underground Railway was another revolution electrified. London had pioneered underground trains in the Victorian period, but they had been powered by steam. Passengers sat in hot, choking tunnels filled with smoke, coughing their way through the daily commute. By the Edwardian era, electricity arrived to banish the fumes. The new electric trains were faster, cleaner, and most importantly, didn't leave you smelling like you'd spent the morning inside a chimney. For commuters, it was a revelation. For city planners, it was salvation. Finally, a way to move masses of people without suffocating them in soot. Still, the underground wasn't free from drama. Edwardians descended into the tunnels with a mix of fascination and dread. On one hand, the trains were marvels of efficiency. On the other, the idea of being whisked through dark tunnels by unseen forces felt unnervingly close to being trapped in a haunted mine. Some passengers swore they could hear the wires humming, like sinister whispers in the dark. The occasional spark or flicker of light didn't help. Humorists joked that riding the tube was like taking tea with Lucifer. Pleasant enough if you ignored the brimstone. Photos, however, were affordable. This was perhaps the most radical thing of all. Electric trams and trains weren't just for the wealthy. They were for everyone. Working-class families could hop aboard for pennies, travelling distances that would once have been unimaginable on foot. Teenagers used them for adventures, workers relied on them for survival, and shoppers treated them as extensions of the high street. The democratization of mobility changed city life as profoundly as electric light had changed the streets. The technology behind these marvels wasn't always tidy. Wires strung above tram lines sparked constantly, showering intersections with tiny flashes that alarmed newcomers but delighted children. Overhead poles occasionally lost contact, leaving trams stalled in the middle of streets, their drivers yanking ropes and muttering curses. Underground electrical failures could plunge entire stations into darkness, trapping commuters in eerie silence until engineers scrambled to fix the problem. These glitches reminded everyone that electricity was still an unruly servant, powerful but not yet perfectly tamed. The social impact, however, outweighed the risks. For the first time, cities could truly sprawl. People no longer had to live within walking distance of their jobs. Suburbs sprouted like mushrooms, linked by tram lines and train tunnels. This reshaped not only the geography of cities but their culture. Families enjoyed more space, workers endured longer but more manageable commutes, and city centres grew more crowded and lively as people poured in from every direction. And then there was the sheer thrill of it. Riding an electric tram or underground train was for many Edwardians the closest thing to flying. The sensation of movement without visible effort, the absence of smoke, the quiet hum, the sudden acceleration was intoxicating. Children pressed their noses to the windows, squealing as sparks flashed outside. Adults, even while pretending to be calm and modern, secretly marvelled at the feeling of being propelled by lightning itself. Electrified public transport was more than convenience. It was a symbol of the modern city. Fast, connected, buzzing with energy. It carried workers to factories, ladies to department stores, and entire families to parks on Sunday afternoons. It stitched together the rhythms of Edwardian life, shrinking distances and accelerating time. Yes, there was the occasional accident, the odd electrocution scare, and the frequent horse that bolted in terror. But no one could deny that the city had changed forever. The commute would never again be the same, and as Edwardians clutched their hats, dodged sparks, and marvelled at the speed of it all, they realised they were living in a new age, an age when even a trip to the office felt like a ride into the future. Electricity didn't just change how people commuted, cooked, or cleaned, it changed how they escaped. The Edwardian appetite for fun was as hearty as their appetite for roast beef, and nothing fed it quite like theatres, music halls, and, later, cinemas lit and powered by electricity. Theatres had existed for centuries. Music halls had entertained countless Victorians with bawdy tunes, but the glow of electricity transformed entertainment from a dimly lit pastime into a dazzling spectacle. Films looked even scarier when the whole room glowed like a giant lightning bug. Before electricity, attending the theatre was an experience defined by shadows. Gaslight illuminated the stage, but did so with flickering unreliability, leaving half the actors' faces in gloom and bathing the audience in a haze of smoke. Patrons fanned themselves not from heat alone, but to keep the stench of gas and oil at bay. And then there was the fire hazard. A single toppled lamp could reduce an entire playhouse to ashes in minutes. With electricity, all of that changed. Suddenly, stages blazed with light so strong that every actor's expression could be seen, every costume shimmered, every detail of the set leapt forward. For the first time, theatre felt less like squinting at shadows and more like being transported into another world. Producers seized the opportunity with glee. Electric spotlights became the stars behind the stars, capable of following actors across the stage, bathing heroines in radiant halos, or throwing villains into dramatic silhouette. Backdrops glowed with colours never possible before, and entire stage tricks were reinvented. Imagine the gasp of an audience as a fairy character appeared bathed in shimmering electric light, or as a thunderstorm rumbled with real flashes that didn't come from a stagehand furiously shaking a piece of tin. Electricity turned theatre into illusion on steroids, without the lingering smell of singed eyebrows. Music halls were no less transformed. These venues thrived on energy, loud songs, raucous laughter, the clinking of glasses, and electricity only amplified it. Bulbs lined stages and balconies, blinking and twinkling as if the entire building were winking at the audience. Markets outside blazed with so many lights that passers-by couldn't help but wander in, hypnotized by the glow. Inside, electric light meant later shows, safer crowds, and a more carnival-like atmosphere. A working-class man who once trudged into a smoky hall now found himself stepping into a glittering palace of bulbs. The songs were the same, cheeky, sentimental, or just plain rowdy, but the setting had become electrified magic. And then came the cinema. Silent films had begun to appear in the late Victorian period, but electricity made them a cultural explosion. Electric projectors meant brighter, clearer images, and electric lighting created atmospheres that gas lamps never could. Sitting in a cinema hall bathed in the strange glow of the projector beam, audiences were spellbound. The flickering images on screen felt almost alive, and the electric hum in the background made it feel as though the building itself was vibrating with anticipation. Children clutched their parents, women gasped into handkerchiefs, and men muttered approvingly as Charlie Chaplin slipped on yet another banana peel. The cinema was more than entertainment. It was a social equalizer. Unlike theatres and music halls, which often catered to specific classes, the cinema drew everyone. For the price of a ticket cheaper than a decent dinner, you could sit in the dark with strangers of every background, united by laughter, gasps, or the awkward silence of a melodrama that dragged on too long. Electricity wasn't just powering the films, it was powering a new sense of shared culture. Of course, the glow wasn't always perfect. Early cinema projectors had a habit of overheating, and bulbs occasionally popped mid-performance, plunging audiences into darkness. Music hall wiring sometimes failed spectacularly, showering sparks onto terrified patrons. One London paper joked that theatrics are now more electric than dramatic, but these hiccups were part of the thrill. If the lights flickered, you weren't annoyed. You were reminded that you were sitting in the lap of modernity, literally surrounded by lightning, tamed into entertainment. Electricity also transformed the business side of fun. Longer hours meant theatres could pack in more performances. Cinemas could show reels late into the night, and music halls could keep audiences drinking until closing time. Profits soared, and owners reinvested in ever grander displays of light. Competition was fierce. One theatre might boast of 2,000 bulbs in its marquee. Another claimed 5,000. The bragging rights weren't about the playbill. It was about how bright you could make the city block glow. If you could see it from across town, you were winning. For the public, the glow of entertainment meant something more than mere distraction. It was proof that they lived in a modern, exciting world. To walk down a city street ablaze with lit theatres and music halls was to feel that one was part of something new, vibrant and unstoppable. The Victorians had found their joy in gaslit taverns and candlelit plays. The Edwardians, by contrast, lived in an age where night itself was a stage, and electricity was the star performer. The glow of entertainment was intoxicating, addictive, and utterly modern. It wasn't just about seeing actors more clearly or laughing at films. It was about stepping into a space where the future hummed all around you, brighter than anything your grandparents could have imagined. In those theatres, halls and cinemas, Edwardians didn't just watch stories, they watched electricity tell them. Electricity didn't just light up Edwardian homes and theatres, it also slithered its way into medicine, or at least the performance of medicine. To many doctors, inventors and opportunists, electricity was not only the power of the future, but also the cure for every problem under the sun. Insomnia, arthritis, romantic problems, just apply 200 volts and pray your hair stays attached. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were fertile ground for medical optimism mixed with utter nonsense. Germ theory had gained traction, but antibiotics didn't exist yet. Anesthesia was still rudimentary, and most people had endured a lifetime of cures that were worse than the disease. If leeches, mercury and rest cures hadn't worked, why not try zapping yourself with lightning in a box? Electricity was mysterious, modern and terrifyingly powerful, exactly the qualities you want in something you're strapping to your body. Legitimate doctors weren't entirely innocent of this craze. Some genuinely believed that controlled electrical currents could stimulate muscles, relieve pain, or even reawaken dormant organs. Early physiotherapists experimented with electrotherapy machines, attaching wires to patients and sending gentle jolts through aching limbs. To be fair, there was a kernel of truth here. Electricity can stimulate muscles and nerves, but Edwardians didn't stop at truth. They sprinted into a carnival of quackery. Soon, the market was flooded with contraptions claiming miraculous results. There were electric belts promising to cure impotence by sending vital currents through the body. There were electric combs that allegedly stimulated hair growth, although what they mostly stimulated was static cling. There were electric corsets said to invigorate the female system, and electric socks meant to ward off rheumatism. Entire catalogues gleamed with promises that if you simply wired yourself up like a Christmas tree, you'd be healthier, stronger, and more attractive. Some of these devices looked vaguely respectable. Polished brass, dials, neat cords. Others looked like medieval torture equipment repurposed for modern living. A popular home gadget was the violet ray machine, a handheld wand that emitted sparks of purple light, supposedly curing everything from acne to depression. The sight of people enthusiastically zapping themselves in the name of beauty would have been hilarious if it weren't also slightly tragic. Of course, not everyone was fooled. Satirical magazines lampooned the craze mercilessly. Cartoons showed balding men frying their scalps in vain attempts to sprout hair, or frazzled women tangled in wires while trying to invigorate their nerves. Doctors rolled their eyes at some of the more outrageous claims, warning that most of these machines had no scientific basis whatsoever. But the public didn't care. Electricity was still so new, so exotic, that people were willing to believe it could do anything. And sometimes the treatment seemed to work, not because of electricity, but because of the placebo effect. Patients emerged from electric sessions declaring themselves invigorated, convinced that invisible currents had restored their vitality. In reality, they had simply been jolted awake in the same way a stiff cup of coffee might do the trick. But when you've been told your nerves are weak and a machine makes them buzz, who's to say it didn't help? There were also darker sides to this fad. Some machines delivered currents far stronger than was remotely safe, leaving patients burned, shaken, or worse. A few charlatans went so far as to claim their devices could cure cancer, tuberculosis, or insanity. Families desperate for hope sometimes spent fortunes on these useless and sometimes harmful gadgets. Lawsuits occasionally followed, though prosecutions were rare. It was difficult to regulate a technology most people barely understood. Still, the craze flourished because it tapped into a deep Edwardian anxiety, the fear of modern life draining the body. Cities were larger, work was faster, stress was higher. People worried that they were becoming weak, nervous and tired from the relentless pace of progress. Electricity was sold as the antidote to modernity's own ailments. If the modern world was powered by electricity, then surely plugging yourself into it would recharge you like a lamp. Some treatments even became social events. Salons offered electric facials where clients reclined under buzzing wands, while clinics invited patients to sit in chairs that pulsed with current. Advertisements showed elegant women enjoying invigorating sparks as though they were sipping champagne. Men were urged to buy electric belts as proof of vitality, often with winking suggestions that the results extended beyond mere health. In short, if you weren't zapping yourself, were you really keeping up with the times? The irony, of course, is that many Edwardians feared electricity in the streets. Wires dangling overhead, sparks flying from trams, yet willingly strapped themselves to machines promising electric rejuvenation. Fear and faith went hand in hand. Electricity might kill you, yes, but it might also restore your youth, clear your skin, and rescue your marriage. In an age both skeptical and credulous, electricity was the perfect snake oil. In the end, shock therapy and quackery didn't deliver eternal youth or miracle cures, but they did leave a fascinating legacy. They revealed just how desperate people were for solutions, how willing they were to gamble on the new, and how easily the glow of modernity could be packaged into a brass and wire contraption for profit. Electricity may not have healed their bodies, but it certainly electrified their imaginations and their hair. Electricity may have been a marvel in the streets, the theatres and the great exhibition halls, but its fiercest battleground was the home. There, it wasn't engineers or city planners wrestling with its possibilities. It was husbands and wives. For the Edwardians, electricity wasn't just a technical revolution. It was a domestic revolution that sparked arguments over bills, gadgets, and the very meaning of modern living. The husband said, "Electricity is too expensive." The wife said, "It irons shirts faster." Guess who won? Husbands generally approached electricity the way they approached fashion, with suspicion, calculation, and a firm belief that it was an unnecessary extravagance. Many were already wary of bills piling up from coal deliveries, rent, or the occasional extravagance at the tailor. The idea of paying per unit for something invisible was infuriating. At least with coal you could see the heap in your yard and know you were getting your money's worth. With electricity, all you got was a glow in the ceiling, and at the end of the month, a bill that made you want to crawl back to candlelight. Wives, on the other hand, saw electricity through a different lens. Here was power that boiled kettles, toasted bread, and pressed laundry at the flick of a switch. What had once taken hours of sweat and soot now took minutes. It was cleaner, faster, and perhaps most importantly, fashionable. To own electrical gadgets was to prove you were modern, forward-thinking, and just a little ahead of your neighbours. The idea of going back to coal stoves and endless ironing by the fire seemed absurd once you tasted the convenience of plugging in progress. Thus the kitchen and parlour became theatres of marital negotiation. Husbands counted pennies, worried about the monthly expense, and muttered dire warnings about safety. "That kettle will burn the house down, mark my words." Wives countered with demonstrations of gadgets in action, shirts ironed in half the time, tea served before the water boy had even finished fetching coal, bread toasted evenly, instead of charred black on one side. For every shilling spent on electricity, they argued, hours of labour were saved. In an age when time is money was practically a national motto, the logic was hard to ignore. These disputes weren't just about economics. They tapped into deeper questions of gender roles and household authority. The husband, traditionally the breadwinner, saw himself as the arbiter of expenses and the protector of the home. The wife, traditionally the domestic manager, saw herself as the innovator within that home. Electricity blurred the lines. When a wife ordered a new electric iron or lamp without asking permission, was she undermining his authority or simply exercising hers? When a husband grumbled that the bill was too high, was he being prudent or simply resistant to change? The domestic battles could even spill into dinner parties. Imagine a husband proudly telling his friends he'd resisted electrifying the kitchen to save money, only to have his wife roll her eyes and announce, "Well then, he doesn't iron his own shirts, does he?" The room would erupt in laughter, but beneath the humour was a genuine cultural shift. Women were beginning to push back against the old assumptions of male control over household decisions. Electricity gave them leverage because it wasn't just about shining lights. It was about control of comfort and labour. Servants too got caught in the middle. Some husbands saw electricity as a way to reduce household staff, cutting expenses further. Wives, however, often used gadgets alongside servants rather than in place of them, treating appliances as assistants rather than replacements. This created awkward moments where maids found themselves supervised not just by mistresses, but also by machines. "Plug it in, Mary" became a common refrain. followed by the poor maid's whispered prayers not to be electrocuted before supper. For children, the domestic battle was a source of amusement. They loved gadgets, marvelled at bulbs, and begged for more electric toys. They often sided with their mothers in wanting more electricity, finding their father's penny-pinching ways hopelessly old-fashioned. "But father, the neighbours have a glowing lamp in their hallway," was a line guaranteed to make him sigh into his paper. Peer pressure didn't just come from other adults, it came from the children, who associated electricity with progress, fun and the future. And let's not forget the darker edge to these arguments. Electrical fires, shocks and breakdowns were real risks. A wife might beam proudly as her new lamp lit up the parlour, only for a fuse to blow and plunge the house into darkness. A husband might then seize the chance to say, "I told you so," before lighting a smug candle. Yet, more often than not, the repairs were made, the gadget restored, and the family carried on. Once a household tasted electricity, few were willing to abandon it completely, no matter how many spats it caused. Over time, the battles shifted in tone. By the 1910s, more men began to soften their resistance, realizing that while electricity wasn't cheap, it was becoming indispensable. The arguments moved from, should we have electricity, to how much of it should we use, but the domestic battles of the early Edwardian years left their mark, revealing how something as simple as a glowing bulb could disrupt centuries of household tradition. In the end, wives usually won, not because husbands relented gracefully, but because electricity proved its worth in daily life. Shirts got ironed, meals got cooked, and families got used to the quiet hum of progress. Money might grumble, tradition might resist, but the glow of convenience always triumphed. And so, while the bills arrived and husbands scowled, the lights stayed on, the kettle boiled, and the toasts popped up just right. When electricity swept into Edwardian cities, it didn't just brighten drawing rooms or make trams hum along their rails, it changed the very nature of night itself. For centuries, darkness had been a kind of curfew. Streets were murky, shadows dominated, and most respectable people hurried home after sunset. Gaslight had softened that gloom somewhat, but gas lamps flickered, smoked, and only cast small islands of light surrounded by seas of shadow. Then came electricity, and with it, the possibility of a city that never really slept. Edwardians discovered the joy of staying out late and the horror of actually seeing each other's faces. The first thing people noticed was sheer brightness. Electric lamps didn't flicker like gas, they blazed. A single bulb could cast more light than a row of gas jets, turning entire boulevards into corridors of day. Walking down a freshly electrified street was like being transported into a new world. Shop fronts gleamed, theatres glittered, and even the rough cobblestones glowed faintly in the shine. To Edwardians accustomed to half-light, it was dazzling, so dazzling that some complained the lamps were hard on the eyes, as though the city had suddenly grown too honest. And honesty was exactly what electric light delivered. Gaslight had a flattering quality, soft, hazy, forgiving of wrinkles and grime. Electricity, by contrast, was merciless. Lovers meeting in the shadows found their faces suddenly illuminated in excruciating detail. The grime of factories and soot of chimneys, previously concealed in dusk, now stared back at everyone in glaring clarity. Cafes and pubs could no longer disguise stains on their walls. Patrons discovered their companions looked less romantic under a bulb than in the dim glow of a flame. In short, electricity dragged the city out of its mystery and forced everyone to see it as it really was, for better or worse. Yet the drawbacks didn't stop people from revelling in the new nightlife. For the first time, cities became truly social after dark. Streets were crowded with shoppers, diners, theatre-goers and flâneurs, strolling simply to enjoy the spectacle. Department stores stayed open later. Restaurants hosted longer dinners, and pubs and music halls found their evenings extending far into the night. Electricity created not just more light but more time. Night was no longer an obstacle, it was an opportunity. Crime, too, took on a different character. Policemen praised the brighter streets for discouraging thieves and pickpockets, who could no longer count on shadows for cover. But criminals adapted. Instead of striking in dark alleys, they melted into well-lit crowds blending with shoppers and revellers. The city at night was safer in some ways, but it was also busier, louder and harder to police. The glow made mischief easier to disguise, even as it made violence harder to hide. For young Edwardians, electric nights were irresistible. Couples walked arm in arm beneath the blazing lamps, marvelling at the transformation of familiar streets. Working-class families, who had once retreated to bed after a hard day's work, now found themselves lingering in public squares, drawn to the novelty of lighted fountains and glowing shop windows. Children begged to stay up later, insisting that if the city wasn't asleep, why should they be? Entire generations grew up with a new sense of time, not dictated by the setting sun, but by the availability of electricity. The glow also created new cultural rituals. Window shopping at night became a pastime in itself, with crowds gathering outside brilliantly lit displays. Newspapers ran features on the modern evening stroll, describing it as both fashionable and patriotic, proof that Britain could match Paris or New York in sophistication. Theatres marketed themselves not just with performances, but with the sheer dazzle of their lit facades. A night out wasn't simply about entertainment anymore, it was about being part of a glowing modern city. Not everyone was pleased, of course. Some older citizens complained that electric light ruined the atmosphere. "It is too harsh, too vulgar," one critic sniffed, claiming it robbed night of its romance. Poets lamented the loss of moonlit mystery, muttering that the new lamps made every walk feel like a factory inspection. Philosophers worried that the city's pace was unsustainable, that by erasing night, electricity was stealing rest itself. But the younger, hungrier Edwardians weren't listening. To them, brighter nights meant brighter futures. And electricity didn't just illuminate, it invited spectacle. Cities staged electric parades, fountains glowed with coloured bulbs, and landmarks blazed like monuments to progress. Crowds gathered not only to see plays or concerts, but simply to watch the city shine. Travellers wrote home about London's streets, glittering as though stars had fallen to earth. For many, the electric night became an attraction equal to any theatre or museum. The city at night was thus reborn. Darkness no longer meant stillness, danger, or retreat. It meant energy, social life, and a sense of shared wonder. Yes, electric lamps could reveal every wrinkle, every smudge of soot, every disappointing detail you'd rather keep hidden, but they also revealed possibilities. Streets alive after dark, hours filled with laughter, shops brimming with customers, and a sense that the modern city had finally conquered time itself. Edwardians had entered an era where the night glowed as brightly as the day, and while some longed for the forgiving shadows of the past, most embraced the glare, basking in the thrill of a city that sparkled, hummed, and stayed awake right alongside them. For all its brilliance, electricity in the Edwardian era didn't spread evenly across society. While theatres blazed, boulevards glittered, and mansions glowed with chandeliers, countless working-class neighbourhoods remained stubbornly dark. The irony was sharp. Electricity had arrived to banish shadows, yet for the poor, shadows remained. If you wanted electricity but were broke, your best bet was standing near a rich person's house and squinting. The problem wasn't a lack of desire. Everyone wanted the magic of instant light. The problem was cost. Installing electricity required not just bulbs but wiring, meters, and often an entire overhaul of a building's infrastructure. Wealthy homeowners could afford electricians to tear through their plaster and string up the future. Tenement dwellers, living in crumbling flats with damp walls and leaky ceilings, could barely afford candles. Landlords were reluctant to invest in wiring buildings when gas lamps or oil lamps were cheaper, leaving tenants in a limbo of flickering flames and smoke-stained ceilings while the fashionable parts of town basked in brilliance. This created a striking visual divide. Step out into an Edwardian city and you might find yourself in a glowing shopping district, every shop front blazing like a festival. Walk a few blocks further, however, and the scene changed. Narrow working-class streets sat in near total darkness, lit only by the occasional gas lamp or the glimmer of a fire through a window. For the poor, electricity was less a convenience and more a spectacle to be admired from afar. Families would wander into electrified districts not to shop but to stare. Children pressed noses against windows, watching bulbs burn with a steady glow. Their own homes would never know. This disparity wasn't just about light, it was about safety. Poorer districts already struggled with crime, and darkness made things worse. Streets without electric lamps remained dangerous, with alleyways offering easy cover for thieves. The rich could boast that electric lights kept their boulevards safer. The poor still walked cautiously, clutching their purses and glancing over shoulders. Social critics pointed out the hypocrisy. Electricity was advertised as the great equalizer of modern life, yet it mostly widened the gulf between classes. And then there was the domestic toll. Wealthier households could plug in electric kettles, irons, or heaters, easing burdens on servants or mistresses of the house. In working-class homes, labour remained sweaty and exhausting. Washing still meant boiling water over coal fires. Ironing still required hauling heavy lumps of metal from the stove, and meals were still cooked in smoky, cramped kitchens. Electricity had promised liberation from drudgery, but for the poor, it was just another thing to envy. Newspapers sometimes rubbed salt in the wound. Articles gushed about how every modern home now boasts the miracle of electricity, as though the sprawling slums didn't exist. Satirical writers pushed back, mocking the idea of universal progress when whole neighbourhoods couldn't even afford decent gas fittings. One cartoon showed a poor family huddled under a street lamp with their supper, since it was the only light they could afford. The resentment wasn't always silent. Labour groups began to argue that electricity should be a public utility, available to all rather than a luxury for the rich. Some progressive politicians took up the call, pointing out that modernity meant little if only half the city could see it. Yet change was slow. Companies saw more profit in selling electricity to theatres, department stores and wealthy homes than in stringing wires into overcrowded tenements. For many working-class families, the dream of an electric bulb above the kitchen table remained out of reach well into the 20th century. Still, ingenuity thrived. Poor families improvised, finding creative ways to borrow the glow of modernity. Children studied their lessons under street lamps. Neighbours pooled coins to buy a single electric lamp for a communal space, crowding together in its glow like moths. Some even joked about standing on doorsteps of wealthier streets just to soak in the free light. Electricity, in that sense, was like theatre. It was something you could watch even if you couldn't afford a ticket. The cultural contrast was stark. For the wealthy, electricity was a sign of status and progress. For the poor, it was a reminder of exclusion. To walk from a dark, smoky tenement into a glittering shopping street was to feel the chasm of inequality laid bare in light and shadow. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about dignity. The poor weren't merely left in the dark, they were made spectators in a city where light itself had become a marker of class. Over time, electricity would eventually trickle down, spreading to more neighbourhoods, transforming even the humblest homes. But in the Edwardian moment, that process had barely begun. The poor looked on as electricity remade the world for others, waiting their turn, clutching candles, and muttering about the unfairness of progress. So while the Edwardians boasted of their modern cities, half those cities still stumbled home in gloom. The glow of electricity wasn't universal. It was selective, exclusive, and painfully visible. And for those left behind, the miracle of the modern age was just another reminder that progress always shines brightest on someone else's doorstep first. When electricity lit up Edwardian cities, it didn't just illuminate theatres and shop fronts. It also cast light on a new kind of criminal opportunity. Every invention in history has found its way into the hands of people who thought, how can I use this for mischief? And electricity, with its wires, sparks and glowing bulbs, was irresistible. Thieves, vandals and even would-be murderers discovered that the modern miracle could be bent, broken or exploited. Police now had to ask, did he stab you? Or did the chandelier do it? Let's start with the simplest form of crime, theft. Electric wires ran across rooftops, along poles and into buildings, and for criminals those wires were valuable. Copper was money. Quite literally, unscrupulous scavengers learned they could strip wires and sell the metal for profit. This wasn't just petty theft, it could plunge whole neighbourhoods into darkness. One moment, a street glowed with proud electric lamps. The next, residents stumbled into pitch blackness, victims not of a power outage, but of entrepreneurial crooks with wire cutters. Newspapers described gangs of wire snatchers scaling poles like burglars with a death wish, and occasionally paying the ultimate price when a live wire fought back. Then there were the vandals. Electricity may have seemed unstoppable, but its infrastructure was delicate. Sabotaging a lamppost or snapping a cable could cause chaos, and troublemakers knew it. Children were accused of throwing stones at bulbs, delighted by the shower of sparks when glass shattered. Rival companies, locked in bitter competition, sometimes accused each other of deliberate sabotage, mysteriously cut lines or tampered switches. Whether true or not, The suspicion alone created an atmosphere where electricity wasn't just a utility, but a battleground. More sinister, however, were the crimes of violence. Electricity introduced new methods of murder, or at least the fear of them. Rumours circulated about husbands who tampered with wiring to shock their wives, or criminals who lured victims into touching faulty appliances. While documented cases were rare, the idea of electric murder captured public imagination. Court cases occasionally featured electricity as a weapon, with prosecutors spinning tales of wires rigged to door handles or chandeliers wired to deliver lethal jolts. Police found themselves forced to ask questions that no detective of the gaslight age had ever imagined. Was this death an accident, a suicide, or an electro-homicide? Accidents often blurred into suspicion. If a worker collapsed after repairing a wire, was it carelessness, company negligence, or something more sinister? When a bulb exploded and set curtains ablaze, was it faulty wiring, or deliberate arson disguised as progress gone wrong? Electricity's novelty made it easy for criminals to hide behind it, blame the mysterious current, shrug at the unpredictability of modernity, and the trail went cold. Theatres and music halls, with their elaborate electrical setups, were favourite haunts of mischief. Pickpockets loved the crowds dazzled by electric marquees, slipping through throngs distracted by glowing facades. Vandals sometimes tampered with theatre lighting to create chaos mid-performance, leaving actors stranded in darkness or flooded with blinding light. In one notorious incident, a fuse box was sabotaged during a packed show, plunging the audience into panic and causing injuries as people stampeded for the exits. Whether the culprit was a disgruntled employee, a rival company, or a bored vandal was never clear, but the lesson was obvious. Electricity could turn entertainment into disaster in a heartbeat. And then there was fraud. Quack doctors weren't the only ones exploiting the mystery of electricity. Con men sold electric shares in bogus power companies, promising investors glowing returns that never materialised. Unsuspecting citizens bought cheap electric lamps that turned out to be ordinary candles in glass globes. Some hucksters even posed as electricians, convincing households to pay for rewiring jobs that did nothing except empty their wallets. Electricity's aura of modernity made it the perfect tool for trickery. If you didn't understand how it worked, how could you argue when someone claimed your walls needed rewiring for stability of current? The police, meanwhile, were baffled. They were trained to catch burglars, not troubleshoot fuse boxes. Electric crime required new skills. Inspectors who could tell the difference between a broken filament and a cut wire. Constables who could guard power stations against sabotage. Some cities even began employing electrical experts to consult on cases. A strange marriage of detective work and engineering. For many officers, this felt like an invasion of science into their turf, but necessity left little choice. Public anxiety fed the drama. Newspapers breathlessly reported every incident of electrocution or sabotage, stoking fears that electricity itself was a menace. Cartoons showed burglars sneaking along wires like acrobats, or gangsters zapping victims with hand-cranked contraptions. Sensationalists loved the image of the electric criminal, part modern rogue, part mad scientist. The truth was usually more mundane: petty theft, vandalism, sloppy wiring. But the myth persisted. What made electric crime so unsettling was that it inverted expectations. Electricity was supposed to be progress, safety and light. Instead, it sometimes brought danger, deception and death. It was a tool of civilization that could, in the wrong hands, become a weapon. For Edwardians already struggling to make sense of this invisible force, the idea that it could be harnessed for crime made it seem all the more uncanny. In time, regulations tightened, wires were better protected, and law enforcement adapted. But in those early days, when the city skyline still looked like a cat's cradle of live cables and fuses popped with alarming frequency, the sense of vulnerability was real. Electricity had promised to chase away the dark, but it had also given the shadows new tricks. If electricity dazzled the Edwardians with glowing bulbs and humming trams, it also electrified something far less glamorous. The business of who controlled power, literally, not just metaphorically, was as tangled as the wires hanging over city streets. Companies jostled for dominance, governments stumbled over regulation, and ordinary citizens quickly discovered that the future came with a bill attached. Politicians promised affordable power, then sent you bills so high you needed another job to pay them. At the dawn of electrification, chaos reigned. Dozens of private companies sprang up in cities, each eager to stake a claim on the lucrative new industry. Some specialized in street lighting, others in powering theatres, and still others in wiring homes for those wealthy enough to afford it. Rival firms often operated in the same neighbourhoods, stringing their own lines on the same poles, which left the skyline looking like a bird's nest designed by a drunken crow. Competition was fierce, but it was also inefficient. Two companies lighting the same street made little sense, yet neither would yield an inch. Governments initially watched this scramble with bemusement. Electricity was so new that few officials fully understood it, and regulation lagged far behind reality. City councils argued endlessly about whether electricity should be managed as a public utility, like water, or left in private hands. Meanwhile, companies lobbied furiously, waving promises of brighter streets and cheaper rates if only they were given exclusive contracts. What cheaper actually meant was up for debate. Monopolies soon emerged. In many cities, the loudest, richest, or most aggressive firms muscled out competitors, securing near-total control of local power. At first, this seemed efficient. No more tangled networks, no more duplicate poles, but monopolies had a nasty habit of prioritizing profits over people. Rates soared, leaving citizens grumbling that electricity was progress for the few, not the many. In some cases, companies deliberately slowed the spread of electricity to poorer districts, preferring to invest in wealthy neighborhoods and commercial centers where profits were guaranteed. The public backlash grew. Newspapers carried stories of families who longed for electric light but couldn't afford the exorbitant fees. Angry letters demanded government action, accusing private firms of exploiting a public good. Critics argued that electricity should be seen as a civic necessity, like clean water or public roads, not a luxury controlled by businessmen with gold watch chains and too much influence in Parliament. The debate between private profit and public utility became one of the defining political struggles of the age. In London, the issue reached boiling point. Multiple companies operated within the same boroughs, creating a patchwork of grids that didn't connect to each other. This meant if one company failed, a street could go dark even while a competitor's lamps blazed across the road. Frustrated city officials began pushing for centralisation, arguing that electricity couldn't function in a piecemeal system. Yet attempts at regulation were met with furious resistance from companies who denounced interference as anti-progress, while quietly lobbying to keep their monopolies intact. Parliament waded in with legislation, passing acts intended to bring order to the chaos. These laws granted local authorities more power to manage or even take over electrical supply, but the process was slow, complicated, and often blocked by political wrangling. Each new regulation sparked debates about the role of government in modern life. Was electricity a service to be guaranteed by the state, or a commodity to be sold by the market? The answer shifted depending on who held power and how many shares they owned in the local company. Meanwhile, abroad, rival nations offered cautionary tales and bragging rights. Americans boasted of their electrified cities, but critics pointed to the unchecked power of corporate giants like Edison's General Electric. Paris dazzled with its glowing boulevards, thanks in part to stronger municipal oversight. German cities pushed ahead with remarkable efficiency, blending private initiative with government coordination. Edwardians looked at these examples and asked, why can't Britain do the same? Amid all this, citizens were caught in the middle. They wanted electricity, they needed electricity, but they resented being pawns in the struggle between politicians and profiteers. Bills arrived with alarming regularity, sometimes higher than expected, always confusing. Housewives grumbled about mystery charges, while husbands muttered about being robbed blind by men in suits. One satirical pamphlet joked that the only thing brighter than our lamps is the fire in the accountant's pockets. Even beyond price, the politics of electricity carried symbolism. To be electrified was to be modern. To be left in the dark was to be forgotten. Working-class activists seized on the issue as proof of inequality, pointing out that while Parliament debated tariffs, families were still cooking by candlelight. Electricity became a weapon in broader arguments about class, fairness, and the responsibilities of government in an industrial age. By the end of the Edwardian period, progress was being made toward rationalising supply and lowering costs. But the scars of those early battles lingered. Electricity had revealed not just the wonders of modern science, but also the old familiar flaws of human society: greed, rivalry, and politics. The glow in the streets was dazzling, but behind it, boardrooms and council chambers buzzed with arguments over who got to control the switch. For Edwardians, the lesson was clear. Electricity might have promised a future of light and convenience, but it also reminded everyone that power never comes cheap. If the Edwardian home was dazzled by glowing chandeliers and the city streets were buzzing with trams, the factory floor was where electricity truly flexed its muscles. For centuries, industry had relied on steam engines, massive beasts that huffed, puffed and belched smoke like overworked dragons. But when electricity arrived, the industrial world saw a chance to unshackle itself from the tyranny of boilers, coal dust and water wheels. Factories roared into the electric age, and workers discovered that while the air was clearer, the machines were louder. Workers cheered, until they realized electricity didn't make the shifts shorter, just the machines louder. The difference was immediate. Steam engines were centralized powerhouses. One great machine drove a series of belts, pulleys and shafts that snaked across the workshop. If the engine stopped, everything stopped. The system was noisy, inefficient and dangerous. Belts snapped, shafts spun like whips, and one distracted moment could cost a worker a finger, an arm, or worse. Electricity, by contrast, allowed each machine to have its own motor. Instead of one engine driving all, every loom, drill or press could be powered individually. This was revolutionary. It meant greater control, flexibility, and fewer accidents caused by wild belts flailing across the factory floor. Factory owners quickly realized the benefits. Production became more efficient, floors could be laid out more logically, and output soared. Electrification allowed machines to run faster, longer, and with greater precision. In industries like textiles, where speed and accuracy mattered, electricity was a godsend. Looms spun at dizzying speeds, churning out fabrics that would have taken much longer under steam. In metalworks and printing houses, electric motors reduced downtime, increased consistency, and gave foremen something new to shout about besides broken belts. But while owners gloated over profits, workers were left with mixed feelings. On the one hand, electricity eliminated some of the filth of steam. Factory floors no longer had to host massive boilers, meaning less smoke, less coal dust, and fewer sudden explosions when a boiler decided it had had enough of life. The air was cleaner, and the risk of catastrophic blast reduced. On the other hand, electricity introduced new problems. Machines could now run longer hours with less downtime, which meant shifts stretched on, sometimes deep into the night. For the worker, electricity didn't mean less labour. It meant more labour, more consistently, and with fewer excuses for rest. The noise was another issue. Steam clanked and hissed, but electric motors whirred with a shrill, relentless tone. Multiply that by hundreds of machines, and you had a cacophony that gnawed at nerves and eardrums. Workers often left their shifts with ringing ears, shouting conversations over dinner, and headaches that no amount of Edwardian ale could soothe. Complaints about electric nerves became common, with some insisting the constant hum unsettled the body in ways steam never did. Electrification also changed the rhythm of work. Under steam, machines needed time to warm up and cool down. This created natural pauses, moments when belts were adjusted or boilers stoked. Electricity erased those pauses. A machine could be switched on instantly, and it could run endlessly. Brakes shrank, expectations rose, and the relentless tempo of production left many longing for the occasional mechanical hiccup. Progress, it turned out, was efficient but merciless. Still, some workers appreciated the improvements. With cleaner air and better lighting, conditions were less hellish than in coal-choked steam shops. Electric lighting on factory floors meant fewer accidents caused by dim visibility. Tools were easier to operate when motors did the heavy lifting. Women and children, who often formed a large part of the industrial workforce, could handle machines that once demanded brute strength. This democratization of labour was both opportunity and exploitation. More people could work, but more people were expected to. The social consequences rippled outward. Electrified factories boosted productivity, which in turn fueled economic growth. Cities expanded as industries churned out goods at unprecedented rates. Britain's textiles, Germany's steel, America's mass-produced consumer goods all surged under the new regime of electric power. Yet workers, while proud to be part of modern industry, often felt left behind. Wages didn't always rise in proportion to profits, and the promise of progress felt hollow when you were still trudging home after a 12-hour shift. Accidents, too, did not vanish. Live wires, faulty insulation, and poorly maintained motors brought their own hazards. A steam boiler might not explode, but a frayed cable could send a jolt through an unsuspecting worker. Stories circulated of men knocked unconscious by stray currents, or of fires sparked by overloaded circuits. Safety measures lagged behind the pace of innovation, leaving many to wonder if electricity was simply a different flavour of danger. Yet for all the grumbling, there was awe too. Many workers marvelled at the speed and power of electric machines. Watching sparks fly as drills bored through metal, or looms churned out endless rolls of fabric, gave a sense of participating in something larger than themselves. Electricity had turned the factory into a symbol of modernity, humming proof that the world was moving faster and brighter. Even the skeptics admitted that once they got used to the noise, they couldn't imagine returning to the days of soot and steam. Factories transformed not only industry but identity. The Edwardian worker was no longer a cog in a smoky machine, but a cog in a glowing one. Electricity redefined what it meant to labour, to produce, and to live in a modern city where power seemed limitless. Yet the paradox remained. The miracle of electricity didn't free the worker, it only bound him tighter to the rhythm of machines that never tired. Behind every glowing theatre, every humming tram, and every chandelier sparkling over an Edwardian dinner table was an army of men whose names never appeared in the society pages. They were the electrical workers, the linemen, engineers, and repairmen who climbed poles, strung wires, and tinkered with machines that no one fully understood but everyone depended on. Their job description was basically, climb tall things and try not to cook yourself. To the public, electricity felt like magic. To these workers, it was a daily gamble. Safety standards in the early 20th century were, at best, suggestions and, at worst, non-existent. Insulation was flimsy, protective gear was laughable, and the understanding of just how much current could kill a man was still being refined, often by trial and error. Linemen were expected to shimmy up poles with little more than leather belts, iron hooks strapped to their boots, and the stubborn hope that today wouldn't be the day the current jumped. The dangers were immediate and visible. A misstep could send a man plunging 30 feet to the cobblestones below. A careless hand on the wrong wire could mean a jolt that stopped his heart before anyone knew what had happened. Some workers half joked that electrocution was quicker than falling. It just depended which came first. Newspapers occasionally reported these tragedies with grim headlines like "Lineman killed in an instant," reinforcing the public's perception that electricity was both wondrous and lethal. Yet despite the risk, there was pride. Electrical workers were seen as a breed apart, daredevils who brought the future to life. Children gawked as linemen climbed poles like human spiders, dangling against the skyline while fixing a tangle of wires. Neighbours gathered to watch a crew at work, marvelling at the men who touched the very stuff of lightning with their bare hands. These workers were both admired and pitied, admired for their courage, pitied for the precariousness of their lives. The work itself was gruelling. Cities were expanding rapidly, demanding more wires, more poles, more connections. Crews often laboured from dawn to dusk, stringing lines across crowded streets, dodging horses and carts below, while residents shouted complaints about the ugly mess of wires overhead. In winter, poles iced over, turning every climb into a death-defying slide. In summer, the heat left men drenched in sweat, their hands slipping on tools while currents buzzed ominously through cables. Breakdowns didn't wait for good weather either. When a storm knocked out power, linemen were expected to scramble out into wind and rain, climbing into chaos while everyone else sheltered indoors. There was camaraderie too. Linemen worked in pairs or crews, depending on one another for safety and support. They developed their own slang, nicknames and gallows humour. A man shocked but not killed was said to have been given a hot handshake. A tangle of wires was called a spider's dinner. Jokes circulated that if you could still curse after touching a live wire, you were probably fine. This humour wasn't frivolous, it was survival. Laughing at danger helped dull the constant awareness that any mistake could be their last. And then there were the engineers, the men in power stations, surrounded by dynamos that whirred and sparked like caged beasts. Their work was less visible to the public, but no less perilous. Machines rattled at terrifying speeds, belts snapped without warning, and the sheer noise of the generators left many half-deaf by middle age. One wrong adjustment of a dial could overload a circuit, sending fire racing through wires or plunging half the city into darkness. Engineers carried the burden of keeping the new electric empire running smoothly, often without manuals, precedents, or reliable backup systems. They were inventing the job as they went. Unions began to emerge, campaigning for better wages and safer conditions. But progress was slow. Employers argued that the men were already paid danger money, as though extra shillings could replace a lost life. Safety equipment improved only gradually. Rubber gloves, better harnesses, insulated tools, but for much of the Edwardian period the risks remained stark. Many workers carried scars or burns, grim reminders of near misses. Some limped from falls, others bore the tremors of nerve damage from shocks. The lucky ones aged into foremen, the unlucky ones were buried young. Despite it all, electrical workers wore their jobs like badges of honour. They knew that while society marvelled at glowing boulevards and buzzing tram lines, none of it would exist without their labour. They weren't just maintaining infrastructure, they were building the backbone of modern life. String by string, pole by pole, each connection was another step into the future, another proof that the Edwardian world was leaving gaslight and horse carts behind. And so, while the politicians argued over monopolies and the wealthy flaunted their chandeliers, the shock troops of electricity kept climbing. They balanced on rooftops, braced themselves against poles, tightened bolts with frozen fingers, and trusted that today the wires would behave. They worked without applause, without luxury, often without proper safety, but with the knowledge that the city below them depended on their courage. Progress has always been dangerous, and in the Edwardian years, the men who wired the future bore the brunt of that danger. Their reward was not riches, but the satisfaction of knowing that when the lamps lit and the trams hummed, they had strung the veins of the city with their own hands. In the history of electricity, they may not be remembered as inventors or tycoons, but they were its true foot soldiers, climbers of poles, tamers of sparks, and guardians of the glow. Electricity may have been hailed as the miracle of modern life, but in Edwardian cities, it was also a social spotlight, literally. The glow of a bulb didn't just illuminate your parlour, it illuminated your status. If your parlour glowed, you were posh. If it smoked, you were poor. If it both glowed and smoked, congratulations, you were on fire. The wealthy adopted electricity first, turning it into a conspicuous badge of modernity. Walking through a fashionable district after dusk was like strolling through an exhibition. Mansions shone with chandeliers blazing overhead, hallways twinkling with bulbs arranged like constellations. Guests arriving at these houses were dazzled, not just by the hostess's gowns, but by the gleaming fixtures that replaced old gas brackets. To own electricity wasn't simply about convenience. It was about showing the world you had the money to wire your home, the courage to flirt with new technology, and the bills to prove it. For the middle classes, electricity was both aspiration and anxiety. To wire one's house was expensive, but not impossible. A clerk or shopkeeper might save up to have a few rooms fitted with lamps, proudly inviting neighbours over to marvel at the steady, smoke-free glow. But the decision often meant sacrifices elsewhere, fewer luxuries, tighter budgets, and if the wiring was shoddy, it could lead to embarrassing mishaps. Imagine showing off your electric parlour, only for the fuse to blow mid-tea, leaving everyone sitting in awkward darkness while you scramble for candles. Modernity was impressive, but it was also precarious. The poor, meanwhile, watched this glow from the shadows. Tenement blocks and back-alley lodgings remained dark, their residents still fumbling with candles and oil lamps. For them, electricity was something glimpsed from the outside, a shop front blazing late into the evening, a rich neighbour's window glowing like a beacon. Families sometimes wandered into electrified districts just to stare, marvelling at what felt like an entirely different world. Children would press their noses to department store windows, not only to look at toys, but at the sheer miracle of a bulb shining steadily above them. This created a striking geography of inequality. Wealthy boulevards blazed with light, while working-class streets sank into gloom. The divide was visible every night, carved into the city's very architecture. In some neighbourhoods, you could turn a corner and step from radiance into shadow, from modernity into near-medieval murk. Electricity wasn't just a utility, it was a map of privilege. Even within homes, light reflected hierarchy. In wealthy houses, electricity spread across ballrooms, dining rooms and libraries, glowing from elegant fixtures designed by leading decorators. In middle-class homes, it was often confined to a single parlour or kitchen. reserved for special occasions or practical work, and in the poorest dwellings it was absent entirely, replaced by sooty lamps and candles that guttered in the draught. To step from one household to another was to step across centuries, all in the same city block. Social critics noticed. Writers pointed out that electricity, supposedly the herald of universal progress, had instead deepened class divisions. Some went so far as to call light itself a currency of status. To be seen in electric glow was to belong to the future. To remain in shadow was to be marked as left behind. The symbolism was potent. Rich families hosted evening gatherings under blazing bulbs, while poor families huddled by the dim flame of a candle, acutely aware of the difference. And then there were the bills. Electricity was not cheap, and in many cases rates were deliberately structured to favour wealthy consumers who used more power. This meant the poor not only lacked access, but were priced out even when they tried. Satirical magazines had a field day with this, printing cartoons of fat businessmen glowing under 10 chandeliers, while poor families squinted under a single candle stub. The message was clear. Electricity was modern, but it was not yet democratic. Of course, status symbols cut both ways. For some upper-class Edwardians, electricity became too common too quickly. By the 1910s, the truly wealthy began seeking ways to distinguish themselves again, commissioning ever more elaborate light fixtures, stained glass lamps, gilded fittings, even electric fountains in gardens. If everyone could eventually afford a bulb, the elite would flaunt their superiority by flaunting how many bulbs they could waste. It wasn't enough for a chandelier to glow, it had to blaze like a miniature sun. For the poor, light remained aspirational. Many wrote letters to newspapers demanding cheaper access, arguing that children's education and household safety were at stake. Reformers called for electricity to be treated as a public service rather than a luxury commodity. But the reality was that in Edwardian times, light itself was a symbol of inequality. Some dined in brilliance, others stumbled in darkness, and everyone knew it. Electricity had promised a universal transformation, but in practice it was another mirror of class division. At night you could read society's hierarchies not in ledgers or titles, but in the windows that glowed or didn't. The parlour lamp was as much a social signal as a butler's livery or a carriage at the door. To own light was to own status. To lack it was to be reminded, every evening, that the future had not yet arrived for you. For every Edwardian dazzled by the blaze of electric lamps, there was someone grumbling that the old ways were better. Change, after all, is rarely welcomed with open arms, especially when it disrupts habits, businesses, and the carefully polished nostalgia of a generation. Traditionalists clung to gas lamps and oil lanterns like prized relics, insisting they were warmer, softer, and more romantic. They swore gaslight was more romantic, mostly because it hid how ugly everyone looked. The resistance had practical roots. Entire industries were built around gas. Gas companies had supplied cities for decades, laying pipes, staffing factories, and installing fixtures. They weren't about to sit quietly while electricity threatened their monopoly. Advertisements proclaimed the virtues of gaslight: safer, steadier, cheaper. Pamphlets warned of the dangers of electricity, fires, shocks, and mysterious nerve troubles caused by prolonged exposure. Gas lobbyists filled newspapers with horror stories about electrocutions, conveniently omitting the occasional explosion from leaky gas mains. Homeowners, too, hesitated. For those who had invested heavily in gas fittings, ornate brackets, etched glass shades, elaborate chandeliers, the idea of ripping everything out for electric wires seemed wasteful. Why trade the cosy flicker of a flame for the harsh glare of a bulb? One critic sniffed that electric light was fit for a warehouse, not a drawing room. And indeed, early bulbs were unflattering, bright, glaring, and merciless on skin tones. Lovers found themselves exposed in ways that gaslight had always softened. Suddenly, wrinkles, soot stains, and tired eyes were impossible to hide. Gaslight was forgiving, electricity was cruel. Then there was habit. People had lived with gas and candles for generations. Lighting a lamp was a ritual. Striking a match, adjusting the flame, watching the room slowly fill with glow. Electricity stripped all that away. Flip a switch, and bam, the room was lit, without ceremony or charm. For many, this abruptness felt jarring, even soulless. The act of lighting a lamp had been intimate. The act of pressing a switch was mechanical. In their eyes, electricity robbed evenings of atmosphere, reducing warmth to efficiency. Romantics and artists joined the chorus of dissent. Poets lamented the loss of shadow and mystery, declaring that gaslight had given cities their soul. Painters grumbled that electric glare ruined the subtle interplay of light and dark in night scenes. Even theatre-goers sometimes complained that electric lighting was too strong, too exposing. Gaslight had flattered, electricity revealed. The old glow was nostalgic, sepia-toned in memory, while the new glow was sharp, unblinking, and for many, unnerving. There was also fear of the unfamiliar. People worried that electricity coursing through walls was unnatural, even dangerous. Could wires leak current the way gas pipes leaked fumes? Would sleeping near a bulb harm one's health? Superstitions flourished. Some claimed electricity disturbed dreams, others that prolonged exposure might cause madness. The gas industry encouraged these rumours, happy to stoke paranoia if it slowed the march of progress. Businesses had vested interests too. Gas fitters, lamplighters, and coal distributors all saw their livelihoods threatened. Lamplighters in particular became the poster children of resistance. Once a familiar sight, men with ladders and poles strolling at dusk to spark life into the streets. They now faced redundancy. Communities mourned their disappearance, sentimentalizing their role as part of the city's character. In pamphlets and speeches, traditionalists held up lamplighters as symbols of honest labour, being swept aside by cold mechanical progress. Still, resistance wasn't just about money or fear, it was also about identity. Gaslight was woven into the fabric of Victorian and Edwardian life. Lovers strolled under its glow, families read stories by its flicker, entire neighbourhoods gathered under its soft haze. Electricity threatened not only to change how people lived, but how they remembered living. To embrace bulbs was to admit that the world was leaving those memories behind. Of course, the defenders of gas fought a losing battle. Bit by bit, electricity proved its superiority. Cleaner, safer, eventually more efficient and crucially cheaper in the long run. Gaslight might have been cosy, but it was smoky, smelly, and prone to accidents. As bulbs improved, their glare softened, their fixtures grew more elegant, and their price dropped. Resistance dwindled, grudgingly giving way to acceptance. Yet the nostalgia never vanished. Even decades later, some Edwardians would recall gaslit nights with wistful sighs, as though electricity had stolen something intangible from their lives. In the end, resistance to change wasn't irrational. It was human. People weren't just clinging to lamps. They were clinging to a way of life, to familiarity, to the comforting rituals of the past. Electricity wasn't just progress, it was disruption, stripping away old certainties and replacing them with something brighter but less understood. And so, for a time, gaslight lingered alongside electric bulbs, a compromise between nostalgia and necessity. The irony, of course, is that the very same critics who once denounced electricity as cold and ugly would later denounce neon and cinema as too bright, longing for the warm glow of early bulbs. Every generation clings to its own light, and every generation eventually insists the next one is blinding. No technological revolution is complete without newspapers swooping in to shout about it, and electricity was no exception. If Edwardian streets glowed with bulbs, the front pages glowed with headlines. Journalists fell over themselves to hail electricity as the miracle of the century, the force that would transform society, save lives, and perhaps even iron your shirts for you. Articles promised electricity would make life effortless. Spoiler, it mostly just made bills higher. The press adored electricity because it sold stories. What could be more captivating than an invisible power harnessed from nature, tamed and delivered straight into homes? Readers who barely understood where thunder came from now devoured stories about harnessing lightning for human use. Editors ran sensational headlines like "Cities aglow with the fire of the future" and "The daylight that never dies." It was science wrapped in poetry, and it gave journalists an excuse to sprinkle metaphors about Prometheus across their columns. Newspapers framed electricity as progress incarnate. They published glowing reports of electrified theatres, trams and department stores, painting a picture of modern cities marching confidently into the future. They described bulbs shining steadily without smoke or flicker, marvelling that darkness itself had been banished. To an Edwardian public eager for proof that their era was the most advanced in history, these stories were irresistible. Reading about electricity wasn't just informative, it was patriotic. If London, Manchester or Glasgow glittered with bulbs, it meant Britain was keeping pace with Paris, Berlin and New York. But the hype didn't stop at reportage. Journalists often crossed into speculation, spinning visions of the future that made Jules Verne look restrained. Columns predicted entire homes run by electricity, meals cooked at the touch of a button, washing done automatically, houses cleaned by mechanical servants. Some even imagined flying machines powered by invisible currents or whole cities shielded under glowing electric domes. These predictions blurred science and fantasy, but they fed the sense that electricity wasn't just a utility, it was destiny. Of course, journalists also loved drama, and electricity provided plenty. Accidents were reported with breathless excitement. If a lineman fell from a pole or a faulty wire caused a fire, headlines shouted about death by current. Readers devoured these stories with the same morbid fascination they brought to train crashes or shipwrecks. Electricity was a marvel, yes, but it was also a menace, and nothing sold papers like a hint of danger. Some publications leaned into the paranoia, running exposés about the risks of faulty wiring, electrocutions, or the supposed health effects of living near power lines. Was electricity progress, or was it frying our brains? Buy tomorrow's paper to find out. The gas industry, still desperate to defend its turf, exploited the media too. Paid articles extolled the virtues of gaslight while highlighting every misstep of electric companies. If a bulb shattered, it became proof that electricity was unstable. If bills rose, it was evidence of corporate greed. Gas companies courted sympathetic journalists hoping to sway public opinion. Electricity may have had the brighter future, but gas still had ink in its corner. Advertisements were another battlefield. Newspapers brimmed with ads for electric gadgets, each promising to revolutionize domestic life. No more smoke, no more soot, the future in your kitchen today, trumpeted ads for electric kettles and irons. Quack devices also took full advantage with violet ray machines and electric belts marketed as miracle cures, their claims wrapped in the same language of progress and inevitability. If the press reported electricity as magic, advertisers sold it as personal magic for the modest price of half your salary. Some journalists were skeptics, and they carved out a niche mocking the craze. Satirical magazines like Punch lampooned the obsession, publishing cartoons of families glowing under absurdly oversized bulbs, or hapless men shocked senseless by modern convenience. Witty columns skewered the breathless optimism of electric companies, pointing out that for all the promises of effortless living, most households still boiled water over coal and relied on servants to scrub floors. Electricity, one quip ran, has made life easier if your definition of easier is being able to see your debts more clearly at night. Yet despite the satire, the overall tone of Edwardian media was one of excitement. Electricity gave newspapers what they loved most, a story that blended science, society, and spectacle. They could print earnest reports about progress in one column, scare readers with electrocution stories in the next, and sell gadget ads right beside them. For editors, electricity was a gift that kept on giving. The irony is that much of what the media promised came true, eventually, but not in the Edwardian era. Automatic washing, fully electrified homes, labour-saving appliances, these would arrive decades later. But for Edwardians, the press created a tantalising sense of imminence. The future wasn't some distant fantasy, it was right around the corner, glowing faintly in the filaments of a bulb. So the media buzz around electricity wasn't just hype, it was part of the spectacle, part of how Edwardians experienced modernity. They didn't simply walk under street lamps or ride electric trams. They read about them, argued about them, and dreamed about what they might mean. Zoo papers turned electricity from a utility into a cultural phenomenon, ensuring that when the lights came on, people didn't just see better, they felt part of a story bigger than themselves. Electricity wasn't just a domestic marvel, it was also a matter of international pride. In the Edwardian era, nations didn't just compete in battleships and colonies, they competed in bulbs. Paris, Berlin, New York, and London all wanted to claim the title of most modern city, and electrification became the measuring stick. If Paris was the city of light, London was the city of flickering, overpriced light. Paris had a head start. Even before the Edwardians, the French capital marketed itself as La Ville Lumière, the city of light. Gaslight had given Paris a romantic glow in the 19th century, but by the turn of the 20th, Electricity had turned it into something far more dazzling. The Exposition Universelle of 1900 cemented Paris's reputation, bathing entire exhibition halls in electric brilliance. The Eiffel Tower itself was festooned with thousands of bulbs, glowing like a mechanical star. Visitors gasped, wrote home, and declared that the future belonged to France, or at least to French electricians. The city took pride in making night as radiant as day, ensuring that anyone arriving by train or boat would be greeted with a spectacle of brilliance unmatched anywhere else. New York, however, wasn't going to let Paris keep the crown uncontested. If Paris glowed elegantly, New York blazed aggressively. Times Square, then still known as Longacre Square, erupted with electric signs so enormous and garish they made European advertisements look timid. Broadway became the Great White Way, a canyon of glowing bulbs that dazzled theatre-goers and terrified horses. The city revelled in scale, bigger, brighter, louder. Where Paris used electricity as art, New York wielded it like a fist, announcing that America wasn't just catching up with Europe, it was outshining it. Berlin, meanwhile, was the efficient rival. German engineers approached electrification with the same rigour they brought to steel and chemistry. Berlin's power grids were carefully planned. Its trams ran with enviable precision, and its exhibition halls showcased not just glowing bulbs but cutting-edge electrical engineering. If Paris flaunted glamour and New York flexed muscle, Berlin exuded competence. Visitors often remarked on how seamlessly electricity seemed to integrate into German urban life, as though the whole city had been built with wires in mind. Industrial electrification there also surged ahead, giving Germany a competitive edge in manufacturing and setting the stage for its economic might. And then there was London. Britain was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, yet by the Edwardian period, its capital lagged awkwardly behind in electrification. Gas companies still held powerful sway, and the city's electrical supply was a patchwork of competing firms, each running their own systems with little coordination. One district might glow with electric lamps, while the next still stumbled along under gaslight. Tourists arriving from Paris or Berlin were often unimpressed, muttering that London was too smoky, too dim, and too disorganised for a nation that prided itself on global leadership. The press in rival nations gleefully mocked Britain's uneven progress, painting London as an old lion trying to roar in the age of lightning. Still, London wasn't entirely in the dark. Areas like the West End dazzled with electric theatres and glowing shop fronts, while the newly electrified Underground offered commuters a glimpse of the future. Theatres on Shaftesbury Avenue and department stores like Selfridge's marketed themselves as temples of modernity, showing that Britain could still shine when it put its mind and money to it. But compared to the spectacle of Paris's boulevards or the blinding chaos of New York, London's efforts often felt cautious, even stingy. This international rivalry wasn't just about civic pride, it had geopolitical undertones. Electricity symbolised national strength. A city that glowed was a city that mattered. When Paris lit up the Eiffel Tower, it wasn't just an engineering feat, it was a statement of cultural dominance. When New York plastered Broadway with electric signs, it was declaring America's industrial superiority. When Berlin ran trams with precision, it was showcasing German efficiency. And when London flickered hesitantly, it reflected Britain's struggle to adapt its imperial grandeur to modern innovation. Edwardians were acutely aware of these comparisons. Newspapers fretted that Britain was falling behind in the race of progress. Travellers returned from abroad with stories of electric wonders, embarrassing their compatriots with tales of continental brilliance. Politicians debated whether the nation's hesitation over centralising electricity was undermining its global standing. Was Britain destined to lead the modern age, or to grumble about bills while others raced ahead? Of course, ordinary citizens often saw the competition differently. For them, international sparks translated into local experiences, whether their street lamp flickered, whether their tram was on time, whether their theatre glowed as brightly as the one in Paris they'd read about. Some took pride in knowing that Britain was catching up, while others muttered that progress should begin at home, not on the front pages. By the eve of the First World War, no single city could claim absolute dominance. Paris retained its glamour, New York its brashness, Berlin its efficiency, and London its muddled charm. Each city reflected its national character through the way it wielded electricity. Together, They demonstrated that modernity wasn't uniform, it was competitive, uneven, and proudly distinct. For Edwardians, keeping an eye on these sparks abroad was both humbling and inspiring. Their own cities might flicker, but they belonged to a world racing toward light, and if the comparisons stung, if Paris seemed too dazzling, New York too loud, Berlin too organised, at least Britain could still comfort itself with the thought that nobody beat it at queuing for trams, electric or otherwise. By the end of the Edwardian era, the world had gone from gaslit gloom to an electric glow that seemed unstoppable. At first, electricity had been a novelty, a parlour trick to make guests gasp, a spectacle for world fairs, and a risky indulgence for the rich, but by the 1910s it was already shifting into something bigger, a foundation for modern life. The Edwardians made electricity glamorous. We turned it into traffic lights and phone chargers, progress but less romantic. The legacy of Edwardian electrification was that it took something frightening, expensive and mysterious and made it ordinary. Streets that once flickered with uneven gaslight became reliable paths of brightness, where nighttime no longer dictated curfew. Theatres, cinemas and music halls that once smelled of smoke now dazzled with bulbs and spotlights, transforming entertainment into spectacle. Homes filled slowly with gadgets, kettles, toasters, irons, that hinted at the future rhythms of daily life. Factories retooled, humming with faster, leaner machines. The Edwardian world proved electricity wasn't just a fad, it was the skeleton of a new century. Culturally, electricity redefined time itself. For millennia, human activity had been tied to the sun. Work by day, rest by night. Gaslight had stretched the evening, but electricity obliterated the divide. Night became as productive, as social, and sometimes as dangerous as day. People learned to shop later, dine later, and party later. The Edwardians didn't just light up their cities, they rewired their clocks, setting the stage for a 24-hour world. That simple shift still shapes how we live today, from midnight factories to neon-lit bars to the comforting or condemning glow of a phone screen at 2 a.m. Socially, the electric craze exposed divides that would echo into the 20th century. Wealthy families flaunted chandeliers while poorer neighbourhoods stumbled in darkness. Electricity became a visible marker of class, literally drawing lines of light and shadow across cities. But this gap also spurred debates about fairness. Was electricity a luxury, or was it a right? Those arguments laid the groundwork for later public utilities and nationalised grids. What began as a privilege of the few gradually became a necessity for all, and that shift owed much to the frustrations and campaigns of the Edwardian years. Economically, the craze sparked an arms race between companies and governments, with monopolies rising, collapsing, and eventually giving way to more centralised systems. The Edwardians may not have solved the problem of fair access, but they created the infrastructure and regulation debates that would make widespread electrification possible. They set the precedent that light, power, and progress should not be left entirely to profiteers, even if the profiteers still managed to rake in fortunes. Even in science and medicine, the Edwardian flirtation with electricity left a mark. Yes, much of it was quackery, electric belts, violet rays, and hair-growing combs, but those experiments paved the way for legitimate medical advances. By the mid-20th century, electricity was powering X-rays, heart defibrillators and other tools that saved lives rather than singed scalps. The Edwardians didn't know it, but their willingness to experiment, however absurd, cracked open the door to future discoveries. And then there was the sheer psychology of electricity, the way it captured imaginations. To Edwardians, electric light wasn't boring, it was thrilling, futuristic, even romantic. People flocked to see glowing fountains, illuminated expositions, and street lamps blazing against the dark. Electricity was not yet invisible infrastructure, it was theatre. That sense of wonder may have dimmed over the decades, as bulbs became commonplace and wires vanished into walls, but it was essential in persuading a sceptical public to embrace the change. Without the Edwardian mania for glamour, we might not have so quickly reached the point where the world couldn't function without electricity at all. Today, electricity is so ordinary that we barely notice it unless it fails. We curse when the Wi-Fi drops, panic when the phone charger is missing, and groan at traffic lights that stay stubbornly red. It feels banal compared to the glowing spectacles of Edwardian theatres or the awe of a World's Fair. But that is exactly the legacy of the craze. They made electricity extraordinary so we could live with it as ordinary. They turned a terrifying force into a background hum of daily life. The Edwardians didn't invent electricity, but they gave it a stage. They turned it into fashion, politics, entertainment, and class warfare. They made it part of identity, aspiration, and pride. And in doing so, they passed on to the 20th century a world already half illuminated, half mechanized, and wholly addicted to power. So next time you flip a switch without thinking, remember, an Edwardian once gasped, fainted, or nervously crossed themselves doing the same thing. To them, the future had just arrived in a glowing filament. To us, it's just Tuesday. That perhaps is the truest measure of progress,